Everyone can hear me? Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming on a Tuesday evening. We are celebrating the Poornima VYASULU Memorial Lecture. I'm Nivedita. I'm the director for Center for Budget and Policy Studies, and it's my pleasure to actually invite all of you. I joined the organization 9 years ago, so I've been doing this for 9 years, and it's actually been the first time where I'm hosting this as the director, and it's my immense pleasure to do so with the help of a wonderful team that has brought all of this together. I will get a little bit of the logistics out of the way before we start. This event is being recorded and it's live streamed. So it would be great if during the lecture and perhaps later, no one's walking on the aisles. So it would be great if we could just settle. And obviously that will sort of interrupt the live stream, but of course, if it is urgent, you'll have to walk, but just be mindful of the camera, that's all. Okay, so the memorial lecture was sort of a way for us to pay tribute to one of our co-founders who, as 9 years, I've collected a lot of memories, which I'm sure all of you will also speak about. My colleagues and friends will also speak about. But essentially, it's paying tribute to a truly multifaceted individual and her enduring influence on CBPS. And a little bit on that we will cover at the end of the lecture. But the lecture is also about issues that she cared about. So we did speak a lot about health on the way that she engaged with many issues, including women's empowerment, governance, political participation. So these are all issues that was very close to her, and we also wanted to honor her intellectual legacy. So it was not just her memories and that, but also her intellectual heft that she brought into the organization, and that we hope to continue from. We have been continuing and hope to continue. Today we have Professor Amit Basole, who will be speaking about what would a national employment policy look like. Dr. Basole is the professor of economics, and he's the head of the Center for Sustainable Employment at Azim Premji University. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts, and if that was not enough, he also has a PhD in neuroscience from Duke University. So his principal fields of concentration are poverty, inequality, informality, employment, structural change, and the political economy of knowledge, all of which, I must tell you, also resonates with the way in which Poornima VYASULU engaged with work at CBPS. As for me, I am particularly interested in this conversation because of a story that I will tell you. I will truncate the story, and some details I will fictionalize. And I might misremember. I have witnesses, so they might tell me a little later that the details were not correct, but this is the gist of it. So last year, around June, around this time, my team and we had gone to to Telangana actually, to Karimnagar, and we were interviewing a few women on what public spaces meant to them. So we were doing a social mapping exercise where we were trying to track their time. What do they do in the morning? What do they spend time on, etc. And while she was talking to us, one of the women, actually, so they did a very lovely map of the village where they showed us that these are the fields where they work. There's the dam. There was a dam being constructed at the time, which had cut off actually a lot of fields where they were working. It had not been filled yet, and the villages that were going to be underwater were actually not. They were not going to be affected by it, but these were the fields where they worked in when they were working in MNREG or any other work. So farm work was basically now going to be dammed. And so there was this huge, around the village, there was this huge dam that you could see. And so we were, they kind of constructed the dam, they constructed the fields, they constructed. And then suddenly as she was talking to us, and so we kept saying, okay, so what do you do in the morning? What do you do in the evening? And she kept saying, one of the women especially, she kept saying, I do I wake up, I do the care work, and so, we usually do the washing and the cleaning and everything. And after that, watch TV, then you watch TV, and then you watch TV. And then as she was saying it, she started getting very angry. And then she stopped suddenly and she said, "You know why I watch TV all day?" And she, and I remember both Raghavi and I, we were sort of struck back thinking, basically said, the reason why I watch TV all day is because I can't go to work. And the place that I have to go to work, it was usually just across the dam for me. Now, if I have to go to work, I have to take a rickshaw. Then I have to take a shared rickshaw. And then I have to take another shared rickshaw. And that costs me my daily wages. What is the point for me to go all that way just to get my daily wages? It doesn't make any sense. And so and the thing is, when we were talking about, and then she looked at us and she said, if you just sit here and you're earning money, if I don't work, I don't earn. And I remember that was perhaps one of the most foundational conversations around. When I came back, I remember this scene where she says, "You just sit there and you earn money." That felt very powerful. The fact that one that's how I teach about power all the time. That's how power felt. And so what I'm really happy about today is that this is something that keeps coming up, whether you're working in gender, whether you're working in violence. This conversation around work, around who can work, what does it look like, what does livelihoods look like, these are all important questions that we, I think, are grappling with. And so I invite you, Dr. Amit, to actually speak to us about what a national employment policy looks like. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Nivedita, for that very nice introduction and for the really touching story. That was a wonderful way to start. Thank you for inviting me. It's really an honor to give this lecture. I never had the good fortune to meet Dr. Poornima VYASULU, but I know Professor Vinod VYASULU well. And it's really wonderful to have spent the day at the center as well. I had some interesting conversations through the day, which I'm also going to try and bring in to my remarks. So let me get right into it. I gave the title as what should a national employment policy look like. I could have also said what would it look like, it doesn't exist. So this is an exercise in imagining what are the issues that arise when one thinks about something like this. So let me first start by just giving context for why even think about something like this. I think most of you here would know that lamentations around youth unemployment or about precarity, about low participation of women in the workforce, jobless growth, these are all frequent in our media. We read about it often. Should governments be doing something about these issues? If so, what should they be doing? Equally importantly, what should they not be doing? What can they do? What can they not do? These are all questions that immediately arise. The first question, should governments be doing something about this? I'm guessing many people in the room would say yes to that. I'm not going to spend time on that. I'm also of the view that the employment problem is something that governments have a duty to do, a role to play. And I'm using governments as plural intentionally because union, state and local governments all need to be involved in particular ways. So my main contention is that the time has come for thinking about something like a national employment policy with clearly outlined goals and a structure. We don't have anything like this currently, although of course the union government and all the state governments are always carrying out policies with employment goals in mind of all kinds, and we will talk about those because it is really drawing on specific policies that are already there that I am imagining a structure that binds them all together in some way. My horizon is about, I would say, 15 to 20 years. So let's say till about 2040 or so, at which point India's demographic dividend will be over and the proportion will flip in terms of working age, non-working age. I'm assuming most people have heard the term demographic dividend. This refers to the idea that the working age population is larger than the dependent population on either side, the old and the young. Over the next 15, 20 years, we will no longer, we will be aging, we are already aging, and the demographic dividend will be over, and we will be an aging society. Of course, the southern states will get there faster because of lower fertility rates earlier. So that's the horizon over which we are talking about. Now, the details will differ from region to region, but I also want you to keep in mind what kind of people we are talking about when we say employment creation, employment challenge, those kinds of words. We are talking about workers who will continue to leave agriculture, including those who returned to agriculture in the last few years due to the COVID shock. So there's those people. There's workers in all kinds of petty informal work, small scale production, that we are talking about moving into more productive activities. There are individuals who are outside the labor force, mainly women. And then there are the openly unemployed, who are mainly educated youth. Okay? Now, I'm going over a lot of things, by the way, in this talk, and I'm happy to return to anything in the Q&A. So please make a note if you would like me to expand on something. These are the broad groups I want you to keep in mind when we say job creation, employment generation, and so forth. And although the exact estimates will vary, ballpark we are talking about 10 to 12 million new employment opportunities needed if we want to work on getting these groups integrated into productive employment opportunities. Okay? But that number is not so important, just mentioning it by the way. But this is important. By jobs, I mean regular wage salaried jobs. I don't mean self-employment. I don't mean casual wage work. Right? And I could include gig work, though not without substantial changes to the way it is currently organized. And again, I can expand on what I mean by that. Gig work could have a space in the kind of thing we are imagining, but not the way gig work exists right now. Okay, so my remarks are basically broken up as follows. Why do we need such an approach to the employment question? What is the broad vision behind it? What are the principles that drive it? And what can be the structure and components of a policy like this? Okay. This is broadly how I'm going to proceed. And some caveats before I jump in. I'm using the word national employment policy, the phrase, because it's catchy, but really it's many policies, right? There's no one policy here. It's a framework that holds together many policies. Second caveat, my remarks are very general, of course, because the time is also short, and at the national level, but I'm happy to address or to state level concerns, etc., as my knowledge allows in the Q&A. Third, I'm not going to address issues of taxation and financing of policies. Many of the things that we talk about here today are not free. They require resources for the government to be able to do it. And naturally the question arises, where are those resources going to come from? I am not addressing that in the main body of the talk, but I can come back to it in the Q&A. And lastly, I am not going into concerns over data, employment data, jobs data, of which again there has been a lot of discussion, but I'm happy to address those concerns as well. Let's start with just the broad motivations for why do we care about this, and why do we think such a policy is needed. Some of you, the motivation may be obvious, but just so that it's clear where I'm coming from, I'll start macroeconomically. First, there is good macroeconomic evidence that growth by itself is not the solution to the employment challenge. Meaning that the way growth has happened in India in particular, faster growth doesn't mean faster job creation. And in fact, there is very weak connection between job growth and employment and GDP growth. This is what is popularly known as the phenomenon of jobless growth. So employment needs a separate policy focus that is not subsumed under the growth policy focus. That's one big point to keep in mind. Second, for far too long, the Indian economy has been an economy dominated by tiny scale of production, small firms, and a lot of horizontal growth, not vertical, meaning firms grow by splitting and remaining small rather than growing big, and there are productivity implications of that. So that's another reason to worry about job creation in larger, relatively larger enterprises rather than just self-employment, right? So keep in mind that when you talk about self-employment as the solution to the employment problem, really mostly what you're doing is proliferating smaller firms, right? Because startups are a very small part of what we call self-employment, a very, very small fraction. So that's the second reason, the preponderance of small firms and doing something about that. The third, very familiar to many people in the room, the high prevalence of precarity. Precarious work, contractual work, all of this again requires a specific focus to change the situation as far as the quality of work is concerned. So here we are now talking about not only the quantity of jobs or employment, but also its quality. And any national employment policy will need to have a quantity focus and a quality focus. Fourth, high levels of youth unemployment. This is much in the news. I don't need to really belabor this point. Specifically, we are talking about fixing issues around school to work transitions, which are painful in our society. Oftentimes, people spend 2 to 3 years before they land on something that could reasonably be called a kind of a career type of a job. It need not be a great job, but something, right? And 2 to 3 years in your early 20s remaining jobless is psychologically a hard thing to do for not only young people, but their families and so on. And then lastly, we have a problem of persistent disparities which are based on identity, gender, caste, and so on, which all color your lifetime labor market outcomes. So you need a policy focus that is specifically targeted to those disparities, which are not going to disappear just through a general focus on job creation. Or at least that's the claim. People can, that's an arguable point. So these are some of the reasons why we care about this. What's the broad vision here? I'll go back to my point about the demographic transition. So as I said, in about the next 15 to 20 years, we are going to enter the aging phase. So the vision is to create a sufficient number of productive, remunerative, and secure employment opportunities, jobs for all those who wish to work. Thereby, you're enabling the structural transformation of the economy. By structural transformation, economists refer essentially to the transition of an agrarian or a largely informal subsistence-based economy to a modern productive economy. So that transition requires people to move from their traditional livelihoods to new opportunities, and that's what we are talking about when we talk about employment. So it's a very modest vision. Okay? As I was writing this, I was realizing that age has mellowed me a lot. So I'm bald now, and so my ambitions are also suitable to where I am. So it's a very modest goal, which is making this transition into middle income status before we become an aging society. Okay? And I'm using middle income status advisedly. What I mean by that is, for those who are fond of numbers in the room, we are currently at about $2,500 per person per year in terms of GDP. $10,000 is where I'd like to be. That's about 4 times. So we're talking about doubling and a doubling. China is currently about 12. Right? So somewhere in where China is where I would like to see us, not America, which is where many people's attention jumps. America is at $50,000 per capita per person, so much, much further away. Right? So I'm saying just a doubling and a doubling again in the next 20 years, I'll settle for. That's a huge thing. That requires us to grow at 7% per year in real terms over 20 years. Right? So, which we can do. It's not impossible, but it is a task. Right? So that's the kind of the vision, the modest vision. Now let me talk about some principles, broad principles that I'm thinking through, on which the policy framework rests. Okay? The first is a bottom-up approach. We are all familiar in India with the problems of excessively centralizing our policy, imagination and implementation. Right? So we need to have a far more local needs based approach to deciding what is needed where, and then creating that kind of infrastructure needed wherever we are talking about. So the diversity is immense. It's not just states, but it goes below states, below districts even. It's a very heterogeneous economy we are talking about, and we can't imagine solutions to that on a centralized way. One of the most important lessons for me from the Chinese experience is actually this, that their approach was very rooted in local governments from the beginning. Local governments were important partners and drivers of the industrialization and modernization process, and we really haven't done enough of that. So ULBs, urban local bodies, panchayats, need to have stakes. The second big principle is there are a lot of well-worn dichotomy traps waiting for us to get needlessly lost in debates. And I'll give you a few examples, and I'm going to expand on those. Should it be manufacturing or services that drives our growth or employment? Should it be public or private? Should we be focusing on domestic demand or global demand? Should the economy be largely closed or open? Does the government need to intervene on the supply side of the labor market or the demand side? In brief, when I say supply side of the labor market, we're talking about the workers, the quality of the workers, where are they located, and so on. And when I talk about the demand side, I'm talking about jobs, right? The demand for those workers. So all of these dichotomies, is it manufacturing, is it services, is it public, is it private, is it open, is it closed? These are not very useful ways of thinking about it, and I'm going to elaborate a little on that. Before I go there, I just want to talk about two more very broad things and then get into that. The third broad principle, this relates to labor law and legal ways to ensure better working conditions. Right? So I have here a sort of maxim or an idiom. Labor law is helpless without well-functioning labor markets, and labor markets are amoral without labor laws. Okay? So again, this is not an either or. What does the first part mean? Labor law cannot function in the presence of huge surplus labor and vastly excess number of workers relative to employment opportunities, because it's very easy for employers to evade those laws, and the state doesn't have the capacity to police all of that. It doesn't even have the will to do it. So that's where law falls short. But if you don't have the laws, then the market, of course, has no other logic than of supply and demand, as we all know, and it will not really care about what happens to you if you're unemployed or anything else. So we need to have both of those working in concert. Neither alone is sufficient. And finally, the big principle, I'll go back to the social disparities point. Identity-based labor market disparities, gender, caste, religion, there are many of these kinds, need to be addressed on their own terms. Meaning you can't hope that generalized job creation will even out these differences. Although that can happen. Right? You can imagine that if the pace of job creation is rapid enough, then employers no longer have or have weaker incentives to discriminate. They need to fill positions because they see that there is demand for products out there and they want to move products, they want to sell, they want to produce. So they are going to hire people, and they are going to discriminate less than in the absence of such pressure to produce. Right? That logic can work, but I think it's not wise to bank on it completely, and we need specific policies. Now, what are those? Of course, naturally, quotas and reservations come to mind as the obvious one, and we have a history of that. We can go into that also in Q&A. Private sector quotas are much harder to do. A lot of state governments, for example, have tried to do local quotas for locals and things like that, and it doesn't work out very well. I'm happy to address those concerns as well. But we need to do something that addresses these things. The politics here is difficult. I'll spend a few minutes on these issues of these, how to think beyond these public-private and endless debates that we get stuck in. Right? Now, on the issue of employment, whenever you talk about the role of the government, one objection you often encounter is, what do you really want the government to employ everyone? Is that what you mean by the government taking care of the employment problem? Right? Now, there is room to think about something like an employment guarantee along the lines of MG Narega for towns, and we have written about an urban employment guarantee, what that would look like and so on. There indeed the government is coming in with the promise to hire you if you don't have work, but that's a very specific kind of a work. Right? By and large, in an economy as large as India, the government will always be a small player as far as employment is concerned, direct employment is concerned. Private sector is going to be the biggest by far employer in the decades to come. But that doesn't mean that the government is unimportant, not only in the policy making sense, but also in the direct employer sense. And I want to spend a minute on this because this is very important. Public goods and services are key to creating private sector jobs. Okay? Because the kind of constraints that businesses face to expand and grow often come down to issues of lack of public goods and services, right? So provisioning of public goods and services creates private sector employment. And how do you give or provide public goods and services? Through public employment. So there's a very clear channel here. And India's historical underinvestment in key public goods, all of us are of course aware of health and education, but I can add R&D to this list. We still continue to grossly underinvest in research and development, public transport and public safety, basic infrastructure like roads, electricity, water, gas, and so on, now internet. These are key to expansion of firms and global competitiveness. Right? Now, an exception perhaps to the lack of infrastructure the case could be made for cheap data. I think cheap data has been available in the last few years far in excess of what we thought was going to happen, or at least if you had based your experience on things like how successful we were in provisioning electricity or telephones before mobiles and so on, you wouldn't have expected that connectivity would grow so fast as it has done. So this is an interesting thing to understand why this happened and what impacts it has had on firms and therefore on employment. But by and large, I think it would still be a true statement that India is not where it should have been by now in providing public goods. And what I mean by public goods is what I just mentioned. So particularly at local and regional levels, the lack of such infrastructure severely impedes firms on the supply side. And what I mean by that is, even if the demand exists for their goods, firms are constrained and not able to supply it. Okay? And that demand could be global demand. And you could have a firm that is actually competitive when it comes to goods leaving its factory gate. What I mean by that is its unit costs are not very high compared to its competitors in other countries. By unit cost, we mean you take your output and you divide it by the cost, so cost per unit. The problem is that your competitiveness is not determined only by what does it cost for something to leave your factory gate. It still needs to get on the truck, it still needs to be driven to markets, to ports, it needs to be shipped and so on. There's a long chain here, and all of that is public goods. It's not in your hands. Right? So if roads are bad and if your truck speeds are low and you've got a lot of wastage going on, those are just costs that are part of your costs. Unless the private investment of firms in mechanization, modernization, whatever productivity increases is matched by public investment that carries through that competitiveness, you're still not competitive. Right? So that's what I mean by the complementarity. And in interviews, MSME entrepreneurs will often talk about this. I should also point out that if firms, if you want to create jobs, you want to attract investment and attract firms and so on, and you're attracting them by subsidies, tax subsidies, things like that, then once those subsidies and tax holidays run out, they're just as likely to leave. But if they're attracted by good infrastructure, they are much less likely to leave. Right? So, in summary, the public-private debate is unproductive. What you need to be clear about is where is which kind of employment needed to produce what kinds of goods, and then you will get reinforcements, you will get complementarities and not substitutes. Let me come to where do jobs come from. Again, we are stuck for many years in manufacturing, services. Where will the jobs come from? Should India jump on the China plus one? We follow China's route. We create manufacturing jobs. We're not able to do it. Well, maybe services will come to our rescue. There are many, many papers, studies, policy reports on this. But that is also really unproductive. Just take one fact. Even today, China has 20% of its workforce in agriculture. 1/5 of Chinese workers are in agriculture. So, in economies as large as China or India, there cannot be a single sector or industry that is expected to deliver. You're always looking at a range of options, including agriculture. So, currently we have about 45% of the workforce that depends on agriculture in some way. It need not derive its entire livelihood from agriculture, but at least part of it. If you want to get it down to, let's say, 25%, over the next 20 years, we're talking about a 20 percentage point reduction. That's about 100 million people leaving agriculture over 20 years. And that's the kind of employment that needs to be created for them. So, but remember, that still means that 20 to 25% of workers are in agriculture. Okay, that continues to be an important sector. Of course, manufacturing needs to grow. A larger proportion does need to be in manufacturing, but also in services. So you have a range of industries and sectors, and jobs need to be created in all of them. The condition is productive jobs, right? And well-paying jobs. It doesn't matter so much where, which sector they are coming from, and they will come from everywhere. And I'll take just as an example from close to home. This is anecdotal. I have not done any study on this. But I go to Mysore a lot, and before the highway came along, you could get a much better sense of the local economies as you go by. Now it's a bit of a blur, but I went enough times before the highway, so I'm talking about those impressions. You go from Bangalore to Mysore, what do you see, right, in sectoral terms? Right? Of course, you have Bangalore, so you have IT, you have garments, you have R&D. The three big things that come to my mind when I say Bangalore are these. Of course, people may have different things that come to mind. You go to Ramnagar, you have silk. Right? You go to Channapatna, you have toys. You go to Mandya, you have sugar. And you go to Mysore, you have tourism and yoga, heritage and tourism. Right? You're basically covering the entire sectoral arc in this, from agriculture, sugar in Mandya, via silk, crafts in Channapatna, manufacturing in Bangalore, services like IT, and tourism. Okay? And this is just a very small part of southern Karnataka. Of course, it's a prosperous part. Not many parts of the country look like this, where even tiny homes look gorgeous. Right? But that is a possibility. I mean, it is in this country. We don't have to go anywhere else to find it. So you think about, if you want to hold your thoughts on something, you think about that. And you say, how can different parts of the country, which will all have their own specific things to talk, we're not talking about silk everywhere or toys everywhere, but the general principle holds. Right? You have a fairly small geographical area which is very diversified, reasonably prosperous. Right? And you want to think along those lines for different parts of the country. Let me talk very quickly about two other needless debates. So this is basically for all of those who in the room who get stuck in one of these debates later. You can just quickly escape it and say, why not both? Right? Is that too much to ask for? Second is, the third is domestic or global demand. Should we be focusing on exports or our own market to create employment? There's a lack of clarity here, a lot of confusion again, but again there's no either or. In the short run, global markets are important because domestic purchasing power is low. Right? Most Indians don't spend that much money to generate demand for a lot of products. But in the long run, you do want to improve that. I mean, for the obvious intrinsic reason, which is that those are the standards of living. You want to improve them. But also the instrumental reason that growth is going to be sustainable if you have domestic demand. Excessive focus on export-driven growth lands you in trouble. China had that problem. Right? A lot of focus on keeping wages low, busting unions, keeping working conditions the most basic, and remaining competitive, focusing on export markets. Eventually, you are going to have to raise wages at home and sell your goods at home. And that transition has to be made. China did make it, but for us too, that is, you can't bank on exports forever. But it's also true that export markets are far larger than the Indian market, even if Indians were buying. Okay? So there is really no either or. Both are important. And then closely connected to that is the open or closed economy question. Again, a lot of confusion. Should we be Atmanirbhar, protect our industries? Should we be outward facing, be export competitive? Well, again here, I mean, this is sort of in some ways the granddaddy of all of these debates, perhaps only exception being public-private, which we keep talking about again. No economy is completely open or completely closed. So the question is always, how are you open? What are you protecting? How are you protecting it? How much are you protecting it? For how long are you protecting it? And what are you asking in return for those who you are protecting? These are the kinds of questions that are the policy questions. And all the success examples that we know from East Asia and so on are about getting this right. When to protect what, how long, how to demand in return, okay, fine, you get this, but you also have to show this. Right, and so on, so that you're not only breeding inefficiencies. So the strategic nature of trade and industrial policy is something that is well understood in the literature. It's not that we don't know what to do, but real political economy problems are in the way, which is that there are genuine interests that are hurt. All of these policies are essentially robbing Peter to pay Paul policies. So it's difficult to make those kinds of interventions. And I'll just throw in a by the by here, which is something that I don't have time to talk about, but it is perhaps important to gesture to. And I say this usually to provoke my students, but I don't think it's far from the truth. We are the only democracy that is trying to do this, right? Anybody who has succeeded is not a democracy. So we have to keep that in mind, that a lot of these policy decisions are difficult political economy decisions where the state undertakes all kinds of actions that hurt all kinds of groups. And it has been able to do that in all the countries that have done it because it was not accountable. And I'm counting everywhere, including the US, whoever you want to talk about. All of these countries, the UK, the US, Germany, whatever you're talking about, Korea, China, none of them were fully functioning universal adult franchise democracies when they tried this. So we have a very unique challenge here, and we have to be very clear about what can and cannot be done. Keeping, obviously democracy is the non-negotiable part here. I'm not arguing for authoritarianism to achieve this transformation. All right, so let me spend the remaining time, I have about 20 minutes left, let me talk about some of the specific things that come in when you start talking about employment policies. You need first a coordination mechanism across ministries whose incentives and objectives are often quite at odds. This is not only for employment. Many problems are like that, where many ministries have to come together and many levels have to come together. I already talked about union, state and central. I'll talk about it again. But we're talking about, of course, Ministry of Labor and Employment, but we're also talking about finance. We're also talking about MSMEs. We're talking about skill development and entrepreneurship, Commerce and Industry, all of these are ministries who are undertaking actions that relate to what you're trying to solve. And if you're at cross purposes, then you defeat, you know, before you start, you're done for. For example, if you're subsidizing an industry, let's say the Ministry of Industry and Commerce, production link incentives, various other policies are there to subsidize a given industry to promote it. At the same time, if you have tariffs on key inputs to that industries, then they eat each other. You're doing the subsidy, and that is going in the tax. So what happened? In this example, the subsidy couldn't achieve what it wanted to do because it was taken away by the tariff. Right? Now, I'm not saying that this always happens, but there are examples of this happening. There are many examples of what is called an inverted duty structure, where you try to, put up barriers to imports to protect your domestic industries, but then the inputs to those industries also have tariffs. Right? So you need to think about keeping the inputs cheap while protecting from the finished goods and so on. Right? Now this happens because again there are political economy considerations. Somebody who is in silk, like silk manufacturers in Karnataka, might want you to have high import tariffs on Chinese silk because they care about their output. Right? But silk weavers in Banaras want cheap silk. So they don't get cheap Chinese silk because you are trying to help the silk producers in Karnataka. You can't have it both ways. And there are many such examples. So there's coordination required here, which I'm not going to talk a lot more about, but we can come back to in Q&A. So let me talk about what are the components of a national employment policy. As I said earlier, government needs to intervene on the demand side and the supply side of the labor market, both. Meaning that it needs to create employment directly. This is public employment. It needs to stimulate the creation of private sector employment. So there's a public and a private element to the demand side. Keep that in your mind. So keep in your mind a table which has a demand column and a supply column. Within the demand column, there's a public and a private. The demand public is the easiest to understand. It's basically government hiring people to produce the goods and services that we talked about. And as I said, there are lots of complementarities going on here. I should have mentioned an important part given the conversations earlier in the day and so on. Think about government provisioning of childcare. Right? We all know that childcare is one of the key constraints facing women who want to participate in employment. In fact, there is good work emerging now that really we should be talking much more about this than about cultural norms that prevent women from participating. In many parts of the country, it is not norms that are the binding constraint anymore. It is public safety, transport, and childcare. All public goods. If you can provide safe buses, cheap buses, and childcare at home to women, many more women will work. Right? Their families are not stopping them from working. So this is an example where public employment, you're hiring people to provide childcare, and you're alleviating constraints on other people to participate in work. So you're achieving many things at the same time. Right? So going back to the demand and the supply side, that on the demand side, we're talking about government hiring people. And it's not just childcare. We consistently have understaffing in any number of public services. This is a well-known fact. If you look at per capita government employees, India is among the bottom countries. How many government workers are there per person? Right? And I'm talking about other developing countries too, not developed countries who of course have far more. But India has something like 15-20 government employees per person. So we have vacant posts, health, education, many other places and so on, and we have undersupplying of goods. So for each of these things, if you're hiring and supplying, of course I can hear people in the room thinking, where's the money going to come from for all of this? Because the government has to pay, and it pays far in excess of what the market rates are for what it asks people to do. So I'll say this also so that in questions and answers I'll get some angry responses. We pay too much. If the differential between the private sector and the government option is something like 5 times in many cases, we're talking about 10,000 rupees a month versus 50,000 rupees a month for very similar work, reduce that, let's say 20 and 50, that's still a big differential. So you don't have to say bring everyone down to 10 or 20, but if you're going to keep it at 50, then all your workers are in the top 5% of the income distribution. And it's a very strange way to run a public system. Right? You're going to get people who don't live in the communities that they serve. Why would they? They earn 50,000 rupees a month. So they'll commute 10 or 15 kilometers from wherever they are at least to go wherever they go, teach and so on. Of course, they don't go many times. That also we know. I'm not suggesting here that government employees don't work. I don't want to fall into that trap. Right? There are many hardworking employees in the public ecosystem, but we have to think seriously about what are they paid and what can we afford, given how much we need to provide. That's really what I'm trying to emphasize, is that the volume of public goods and services that need to be provided are orders of magnitude what we are doing right now. And we can't afford to do it at current levels. So enough with my stirring up the nest bit. I'm happy to come back to in Q&A. Let me go to safer territory. Continuing on the demand side, which is hiring workers, I talked about urban employment programs. Right? So MG Narega is very familiar to everyone in the room. I don't need to talk about what it is. Can we have an urban program that looks something like that? So now we are not talking about regular wage work or anything like that. We're talking about very basic daily wage kind of work. But we are talking about an intervention where the government comes into the urban economy, hires whoever is willing to hire, willing to work, at some kind of a close to minimum wage, and produces local assets, the way MG Narega does. So the way MG Narega works, not always equally well everywhere, but how it is supposed to work is you create shelves of works at a very local level, Gram Panchayat level. You decide, what do I need to do? Does this pond need to be desilted? Does this area need to be cleared, forested, deforested, check dams built, whatever it is? What asset do I need creating? And then you put up the budget, you get the amount, you get the labor to get that asset created. Small towns in India very often have very similar needs and constraints. You need small assets built. We're not talking about big flashy infrastructure projects. We're talking about small local roads, right? Repairing a few things, cleaning up parks, small things like that. Of course, municipal bodies are supposed to do all of this stuff, but there's a whole different thing we were discussing earlier. Municipal finance is a problem, devolution of funds is a problem. Municipal bodies are usually short of funds and they can't do what they're supposed to do. This could be a way to actually get that done as well. I won't go into the details, we have written about it, but this is a way to create employment in cities for casual wage workers who are underemployed. It's not an aspirational thing. Okay? It's a strictly minimum wage thing. So these are all parts of the whole. Okay? So when you're talking about the demand side, you're imagining alleviating supply side constraints for businesses. What public goods do I need to provide? Who do I need to hire? Where are the needs? And so forth. That's how you're creating these jobs. I'll talk about one more kind of idea that we worked on, which is not about government directly hiring, but about stimulating job creation in the private sector. All through implicitly what I've assumed is that if you enable private businesses to grow, they will hire and create jobs. This is not so simple as that. Macroeconomists, if there are any in the room, will immediately be thinking, this is all fine on the supply side, what if there's no demand for products? Right? So you can't just make firms competitive and magically hope that somebody will come to buy them. That's not how it works. So I'm aware of that, but setting aside that concern, the government can still do a lot to ensure that firms will grow if the demand exists. At least let not the supply side constrain them, which is what I run a business, but I don't know in one place clearly what are the registrations required, how do I open these kinds of accounts, what compliances do I have to do, why do I not need to be afraid that if I miss a compliance I might go to jail. I need some place where I can do this without being myself a college graduate. Because a lot of business owners are not college graduates. And I may not be able to afford a full-time chartered accountant or tax attorney or whatever. So how can you make it easier for me to meet these compliances and enable me to get the advantages of being in the system, which would be, for example, cheaper credit. Right? If I am not in the system, I am borrowing at multiples of what I am borrowing if I am in the formal system. So that makes a huge difference to my capacity to expand. This has to be viewed as an employment thing. Right? So I'm trying to show you how very different kinds of pieces, all the way from Narega or urban employment guarantee to what is popularly called ease of doing business, which is what this is. Right? It is not ease of doing business for Ambani and Adani because they don't need it. Who needs it is the MSMEs who are going to create all the jobs. Right? So that's all part of this story. And then finally, in the last 5 minutes, on the supply side, I will not belabor this point. I have already talked about how if you provide basic services, then workers are in a better position to take jobs. Meaning that they're not constrained to being in a location within 2-3 kilometers, particularly women, right? And so on. So you are enabling a bigger kind of pool for people to take advantage. And of course, for employers, you're creating a workforce that is more prepared, healthier, better talented and educated, at least better skilled, and so on. A lot has been done on skilling, I don't need to tell you here. But oftentimes the problem is not imparting of skills. It's actually matching people to jobs. Right? It's making that happen where employers are looking for workers, workers are looking for work, but they don't find each other easily. Because the traditional ways, the caste-based ways of doing it in the informal economy exist. And then there's a formal system of ads and advertisements and various things, online, Monster and so forth. But there's a world in the middle. People who are neither part of the caste-based economy of the old, nor the online economy. And it's not easy to make these matches. So there's a role for the government even there. There's also a role in making the school to work transition easier. Many countries have these sort of apprenticeship programs. We do too. But I saw recently, I think one of the election things was right to apprenticeship. Right? Now, even if you're not making it right, you can think of it as an important part of the program where you are enabling young people to take that first step into getting some experience, which is how you get started into work. Right? It's that first barrier that is often the hardest, especially for people who are coming from backgrounds where the networks don't exist. Right? So if you are from marginalized castes in particular, or other marginalized identities, then you don't know anyone also to get you the first job. So the government can do this for you. Okay, so I'll just conclude with two things that are not part of this, whatever I've said so far. But I've not said many things. I've not commented on social security and quality of work, etc., which all has to be part of the same imagination. So I've focused almost entirely on job creation, not on conditions of work and all of the issues surrounding that. Happy to address it in Q&A. I think we are in a position now to do a comprehensive social security system in India. That can be done if we have the will to do it. But I will also remind you of what I said, that when you talk about things like minimum wage legislation, conditions of work, working hours, benefits, any number of these things that we want workers to avail, without also tightening the labor market, meaning without reducing the number of workers that are looking for each job, these things don't work very well, because employers always know how to create a black market and hire bypassing those laws. If it's a tight labor market, then they don't really have an option. And that's where you want to be. They don't have, meaning that they offer you a bad contract, you have the luxury of walking away. You want workers to have the luxury of walking away from bad contracts, and that only happens when job creation picks up enough. But I'm not saying that therefore legislation is not needed. It is. Right? It's just far easier to implement those laws if you have the market working with you rather than against you. Finally, my concluding points. The looming issue of climate change mitigation and adaptation. We know that most of these well-laid plans are going to come to naught if we don't pay attention to this. But this is also an employment opportunity, because any number of things need to be done to get climate ready. Right? A lot of things need to change in the way business is done, and all of that are potential job opportunities. So we shouldn't be looking at climate change as a, it is obviously a huge issue and a problem, and lives are going to be affected, but in the fixing of it, if it's not too late, are also certain opportunities. And I didn't talk about them, but I do want to say that those are going to be an important part of the years to come. And then the last thing is something that actually is quite close to my heart. Didn't get time to speak about it today, but that is the importance of culture and heritage in what kind of an economy are we going to be. Right? I think we have allowed our imagination to be highly impoverished in terms of what sort of society is it. Right? $10,000 per capita, okay, but there are many ways of being $10,000 per capita. Right? You look around the world, countries have identities. Their structures have identities, their food has an identity, their ways of dressing, everything has an identity. In India, we have an excess and overabundance of all of this stuff. Only one part of which we call craft, right? But really it is a very small window into something that is huge. So I don't think we get to where we want to get by being bored. We get there by being excited. And I think that culture, heritage, identity are good ways to get excited about who we are and what we can become. Right? It allows us to be in the driving seat in deciding what we are going to look like, rather than always feeling that, well, they did it better than us, which is really where we are right now. And that's not a good feeling. You're never really going to do it as well as somebody else, but you can do what you do very well. So you need to figure that out, right, and build on those strengths. I'm not saying that you can build a modern economy only on craft. You can't. But you can build an identity. And you can build a society where people want to live, feel good about where they live, and you can build a society where people want to visit to experience what kind of a place you live in. Right? All of these things I think are very much going for us, and they are all, of course, employment opportunities as well. So I'll stop here and take questions. Thank you.
ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. Thank you, Mr. Amit Basole, for the insights you have provided in the lecture. Yeah, sure. Please. So I'm sure the insights he has provided in the lecture will spark a lot of conversations, discussions, and a lot of questions. And we would like to address all of those. But before that, we would like to provide a short summary of the lecture in Kannada. So to do the honors, I would like to invite Madhusudan B.V. Rao. So all of you know that Madhusudan B.V. Rao has been with CBPS since 20 years now, more than that. And he has worked extensively with POORNIMA VYASULU in the formative years of CBPS. So Madhusudan sir, please.
ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ಬಹುಶಃ ಅವರ ಒಂದು ಅರ್ಥಗರ್ಭಿತವಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಚರ್ಚೆ ಮುಂದೆ ನಾನು ಹೇಳ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ತುಂಬ ಸಂಕ್ಷೇಪವಾಗಿ ಮತ್ತು ಕೆಲವೇ ಅಂಶಗಳನ್ನು ಮಾತ್ರ ನಾನು ಪ್ರಸ್ತಾಪ ಮಾಡೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಇಷ್ಟಪಡ್ತೀನಿ. ಭಾಳಷ್ಟು ಸ್ವಾರಸ್ಯಕರವಾಗಿ ಅವರು ಮಂಡನೆಯನ್ನು ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲವು ಆಯ್ದಂಥದ್ದನ್ನು ಮಾತ್ರ ನಾನು ನನ್ನ ತಿಳುವಳಿಕೆಯ ಮಟ್ಟಕ್ಕೆ ಹೇಳೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನವನ್ನು ಮಾಡ್ತೇನೆ. ಮೊದಲನೇದಾಗಿ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರೀಯ ಉದ್ಯೋಗ ನೀತಿ ಇಂಥದ್ದರ ಒಂದು ಅವಶ್ಯಕತೆ ಇದೆಯಾ, ಇಂಥದ್ದು ಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆಯಾ? ಯಾಕೆಂದರೆ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರೀಯ ಶಿಕ್ಷಣ ನೀತಿ ಇದೆ, ಕೈಗಾರಿಕಾ ನೀತಿ, ಇಂಥದ್ದೊಂದು ನೀತಿಯ ಅವಶ್ಯಕತೆ ಇದೆಯಾ? ಹಾಗಂದರೆ ಈವರೆಗೆ ಆ ಥರದ್ದು ಯಾವುದು ಪ್ರಯತ್ನಗಳಾಗಿಲ್ವಾ? ಈ ಥರದ್ದೆಲ್ಲ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಬರುತ್ತೆ. ಆದರೆ ಅವರು ಸ್ಪಷ್ಟವಾಗಿ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ, ಈ ಥರದ್ದು ಪ್ರಯತ್ನಗಳ ಒಂದು ಒಗ್ಗೂಡುವಿಕೆಯನ್ನು ನಾನು ನೋಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೇನೆ ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ. ಸೊ ಆ ರೀತಿಯಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಹಲವಾರು ಅಂಶಗಳನ್ನು ಒಳಗೊಂಡಂತಹ ಒಂದು ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರೀಯ ಉದ್ಯೋಗ ನೀತಿಯ ಕುರಿತಾಗಿ ಅದು ಇರಬೇಕು ಅಂತಂದರೆ ಅದು ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ಇರಬೇಕು, ಅದರ ರೂಪುರೇಷೆಗಳು ಯಾವ ಥರ ಇರಬೇಕು, ಅದನ್ನು ಏನನ್ನು ಒಳಗೊಂಡಿರಬೇಕು, ಏನನ್ನು ಅದು ನೀಡುವಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಸಾಮರ್ಥ್ಯವನ್ನು ಹೊಂದಿರಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನೋದ್ರ ಕುರಿತಾಗಿ ಅವರು ಮಾತನಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಮುಂಚೆ ಹಲವಾರು ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳು ಮತ್ತು ಇರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಪರಿಸ್ಥಿತಿಯ ಒಂದು ಪೂರ್ವಾವಲೋಕನವನ್ನು ಸಹ ಸಮಗ್ರವಾಗಿ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಯಾವ ಥರ ಅಂತಂದರೆ ಇರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಉದ್ಯೋಗದ ಪರಿಸ್ಥಿತಿಗಳು ಯಾವ ಥರ ಇದೆ, ಸಣ್ಣ ಸಣ್ಣ ಕೈಗಾರಿಕೆಗಳು, ಕಡಿಮೆ ಉತ್ಪಾದಕತೆ ಇರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು, ಅತಿ ಹೆಚ್ಚಿನದಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ನಿರುದ್ಯೋಗ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳು, ಮತ್ತು ಏನು ಶಿಕ್ಷಣ ನಂತರ ತರಬೇತಿಗಳು ಅಥವಾ ಏನು ಕೌಶಲ್ಯಾಭಿವೃದ್ಧಿ ಇದನ್ನು ಪೂರ್ತಿಯಾಗಿ ಮಾಡಿಕೊಳ್ಳಾಗದೆ ಮತ್ತು ಕೆಲಸಕ್ಕೆ ಹೊಂದಾಣಿಕೆ ಆಗದೇ ಇರತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಪರಿಸ್ಥಿತಿಗಳು, ಇವೆಲ್ಲವೂ ಸಹ ಇರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಒಂದು ವ್ಯಾಪಕವಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಪರಿಸ್ಥಿತಿಗಳು. ಮತ್ತು ವೇತನ ಸೌಲಭ್ಯ, ಕಾರ್ಮಿಕರ ಒಂದು ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳು, ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಇರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಅಭದ್ರತೆ, ಈ ಥರದ್ದು ಎಲ್ಲದೂ ಸಹ ಇರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಒಂದು ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳ ಒಂದು ಇತಿಮಿತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಇದನ್ನು ನೋಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೇವೆ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು. ಇದಕ್ಕಿಂತ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಮುಖವಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಒಂದು ಇದನ್ನು ಸಹ ಪ್ರಸ್ತಾಪ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಏನಂತಂತಂದರೆ ಇದೆಲ್ಲವೂ ಸಹ ಈ ಪ್ರಜಾಪ್ರಭುತ್ವದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದು ನಡೀತಾ ಇದೆ ಅಂತನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು. ಅಂದರೆ ಪ್ರಜಾಪ್ರಭುತ್ವದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದು ನಡೀತಾ ಇದೆ ಅಂತಂದರೆ ಅದರದ್ದೇ ಆಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಹಲವಾರು ಬೇಡಿಕೆ ನೀಡಿಕೆಗಳ ಒಂದು ನಡುವೆ ಇದು ನಿಲ್ಲಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆ. ಆ ಬೇಡಿಕೆ ಮತ್ತು ನೀಡಿಕೆ ನಡುವೆ ನಿಲ್ಲಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆ ಅಂದರೆ ರಾಜಕೀಯವಾಗಿ ಇದು ಸ್ಥಿರಗೊಳ್ಳಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆ, ಇದು ರಾಜಕೀಯವಾಗಿ ಪ್ರಮುಖವಾಗಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು. ಅದಿಲ್ಲದೇ ಇದ್ದರೆ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಒಂದು ಪರಿಹಾರ ಸಿಗಲಾರದು ಅನ್ನುವಂಥ ಒಂದು ಇದನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಮತ್ತು ಈ ಥರದೊಂದು ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರೀಯ ಉದ್ಯೋಗ ನೀತಿ ಇರಬೇಕು ಅಂತಂದರೆ ಅದರ ಮೂಲಭೂತ ತತ್ವಗಳೇನು, ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ದೃಷ್ಟಿಕೋನ ಯಾವ ಥರ ಇರಬೇಕು, ಅದು ಏನನ್ನು ಮಾಡಬೇಕು, ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಅವಶ್ಯಕತೆ ಇರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಒಂದು ಸಮರ್ಪಕವಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಉದ್ಯೋಗ, ಅವರು ಕೌಶಲ್ಯ ಉತ್ಪಾದಕತೆಯನ್ನು ಹೆಚ್ಚಿಸ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು, ಮತ್ತು ಈಗೇನು ನಮ್ಮ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರ ಈಗೇನು ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಈ ಒಂದು ಡೆಮಾಗ್ರಫಿಕ್ ಡಿವಿಡೆಂಡ್ ಅಂತ ನಾವೇನು ಕರಿತೀವಿ, ಯುವಕರಿಂದ ತುಂಬಿದಂತಹ ಈ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರ ಅವ್ರನ್ನ ಸಮಗ್ರವಾಗಿ ಬಳಸಿಕೊಂಡು ಉತ್ಪಾದಕತೆಯನ್ನು ಹೆಚ್ಚಿಸಿ ಕನಿಷ್ಠ ಒಂದು ಲೋಯರ್ ಮಿಡ್ಲ್ ಇನ್ಕಮ್ನಿಂದ ಒಂದು ಹೈಯರ್ ಮಿಡ್ಲ್ ಇನ್ಕಮ್ ಆಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಒಂದು ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರದ ಮಟ್ಟಕ್ಕೆ ಏರಬೇಕು ಅಂದರೆ ಈಗ ಅವ್ರು ಹೇಳೋದು $2,500 ಕನಿಷ್ಠ $10,000 ಅಷ್ಟರ ಮಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಸುಮಾರು 2 ರಿಂದ 4 ಪಟ್ಟು ಹೆಚ್ಚಾಗಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆ ನಮ್ಮ ತಲಾ ಆದಾಯ ಅಂತ. ಅಷ್ಟರ ಮಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಆಗಬೇಕು ಅಂತಂದರೆ ಅಷ್ಟರ ಮಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಆಗಬೇಕಾದಂಥ ಉದ್ಯೋಗ ಸೃಜನೆಯ ರೂಪುಗಳು ಯಾವ ಥರ ಇರಬೇಕು. ಹಲವಾರು ಗೊಂದಲಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಸಿಕ್ಕಾಕ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದೇವೆ. ಯಾವ ಥರ ಅಂತಂದರೆ ನಮಗೆ ಕೃಷಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಹೆಚ್ಚಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದನ್ನ ತಂದು ಕೈಗಾರಿಕೆ ಮತ್ತು ಸೇವಾ ವಲಯಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಮಾಡಬೇಕೆ, ಅಥವಾ ನಮ್ಮದೇ ಆಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಆತ್ಮನಿರ್ಭರ ಭಾರತ ಇದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲವನ್ನು ನಾವು ನಮ್ಮ ಉದ್ಯೋಗವನ್ನು ನಮ್ಮ ರಾಜ್ಯಕ್ಕೆ ಅಥವಾ ನಮ್ಮ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರಕ್ಕೆ ಸೀಮಿತಗೊಳಿಸಿ ನಮ್ಮಲ್ಲೇ ನಾವು ಇದನ್ನು ಮಾಡಬೇಕೆ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು. ಈ ರೀತಿಯಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ರಿಂದ ಹೊರಬಂದು ಬೇರೆದೇ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಉದ್ಯೋಗ ಸೃಜನೆ ಕುರಿತಾಗಿ ನೋಡಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆ. ಇದು ಬೇಡಿಕೆ ಮತ್ತು ಪೂರೈಕೆ ಇವೆರಡೂ ವಿಭಾಗಗಳನ್ನು ಆಧರಿಸಿ ಉದ್ಯೋಗ ಸೃಜನೆಯನ್ನು ಭಿನ್ನ ರೀತಿಯಿಂದ ನೋಡಬೇಕಾದಂಥ ಅವಶ್ಯಕತೆ ಮತ್ತು ಅನಿವಾರ್ಯತೆ ಇರುವಂಥ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ನಿಂತಿದ್ದೇವೆ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದನ್ನ ಸ್ಪಷ್ಟವಾಗಿ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅದು ಹೇಗಪ್ಪ ಅಂತಂತಂದರೆ ನಮಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಬೇಡಿಕೆಗಳನ್ನು ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ನಾವು ಗಣನೆ ತಗೊಳ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತಂತಂದರೆ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರ ಮಟ್ಟದ ನೀತಿಗಳಿಂದ ಇದು ಯಾವುದೂ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಆಗುವಂಥದ್ದಲ್ಲ. ರಾಜ್ಯ ಅಲ್ಲ, ನಾವು ಸ್ಥಳೀಯ ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ಮಟ್ಟಕ್ಕೆ ಪಂಚಾಯಿತಿ ಮತ್ತು ಮುನ್ಸಿಪಾಲ್ಟಿಗಳ ಮಟ್ಟದಲ್ಲಿ ಇರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಅವಶ್ಯಕತೆಗಳು, ನೀಡಿಕೆಗಳು, ಅದನ್ನು ಪೂರೈಸಬೇಕಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಅವಶ್ಯಕತೆಗಳು ಇವೆಲ್ಲವನ್ನು ಪರಿಗಣನೆಗೆ ತಗೊಂಡಾಗ ಎಂಥ ರೀತಿಯ ಉದ್ಯೋಗವನ್ನು ಸೃಜನೆ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು. ಸೃಜನೆ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತಂತಂದರೆ ಎಲ್ಲವೂ ಸಹ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ರೀತಿಯಿಂದಲೇ ಸೃಜನೆ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು. ಸರ್ಕಾರ ನೇರವಾಗಿ ಎಲ್ಲರನ್ನೂ ಸಹ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಉದ್ಯೋಗವನ್ನು ಕೊಡಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನುವಂಥ ಅಭಿಪ್ರಾಯವಲ್ಲ. ಉದ್ಯೋಗ ಸೃಜನೆಗೆ ಪೂರಕವಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಒಂದು ವಾತಾವರಣ ನಿರ್ಮಾಣ ಮಾಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು, ಪೂರಕವಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಕಾರ್ಯನೀತಿಯನ್ನು ರೂಪಿಸ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು, ಅವಕಾಶಗಳನ್ನು ರೂಪಿಸ್ಕೊಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಬಹಳಷ್ಟು ಉದಾಹರಣೆಗಳನ್ನು ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು. ಈಗ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಿನಿಂದ ಮೈಸೂರುವರೆಗೆ ಹೋಗಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ರಾಮನಗರ ಇರ್ಬೋದು, ಅಥವಾ ಚನ್ನಪಟ್ಟಣ ಇರ್ಬೋದು, ಮಂಡ್ಯ ಇರ್ಬೋದು, ಯಾವ ಯಾವ ಸೇವಾ ವಲಯಗಳನ್ನು ಅದು ಸಂಪರ್ಕಿಸ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು, ಅದರ ಪ್ರಾಮುಖ್ಯತೆ ಏನು ಅಂತೇಳಿ. ಸೊ ಆ ಸ್ಥಳೀಯ ಮಟ್ಟದ ಸರ್ಕಾರದಿಂದ ಮಟ್ಟದಿಂದ ಸಹ ಈ ಬೇಡಿಕೆಯನ್ನು ಪರಿಗಣಿಸಿ ಅದನ್ನು ಪೂರೈಸುವತ್ತ ಗಮನ ಹರಿಸಿದರೆ, ಮತ್ತು ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ವತಿಯಿಂದ ಅತಿ ಹೆಚ್ಚಿನದಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಆ ರೀತಿಯ ನೇರವಾಗಿ ಬಂಡವಾಳ ಸೃಜನೆ ಮತ್ತು ಅದರಿಂದ ಉದ್ಯೋಗ ಸೃಜನೆ ಕೂಡ ಆಗಬೇಕು. ಮತ್ತು ಖಾಸಗಿ ವಲಯದಲ್ಲೂ ಸಹ ಉದ್ಯೋಗ ಸೃಜನೆಗೆ ಪೂರಕವಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಒಂದು ಅವಕಾಶಗಳನ್ನು ಮತ್ತು ಒಂದು ವಾತಾವರಣವನ್ನು ನಿರ್ಮಾಣ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾದಂತಾಗತ್ತೆ. ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಬೇಕಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಮೂಲಭೂತವಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸಾರ್ವಜನಿಕ ಸರಕು ಮತ್ತು ಸೇವೆಗಳು ಅಂತ ನಾವೇನು ಹೇಳ್ತೇವೆ, ಅಂದರೆ ಇವತ್ತು ಪಬ್ಲಿಕ್ ಗೂಡ್ಸ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಸರ್ವಿಸ್ ಅಂತ ನಾವೇನು ಕರಿತೇವೆ, ಇದು ನಮ್ಮ ಒಂದು ಇಡೀ ಒಂದು ಅಭಿವೃದ್ಧಿಗೆ ಇದು ಒಂದು ಇಂಜಿನ್ ಅಂತ ನಾವೇನು ಕರಿತೇವೆ, ಅಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಇದರ ಸೃಜನೆಯತ್ತ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಗಮನ ಹರಿಸಿದಾಗ ಇದು ಬಹಳ ಸಮರ್ಪಕವಾಗಿ ಆಗ್ತದೆ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದನ್ನು ಸ್ಪಷ್ಟವಾಗಿ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ. ಅದಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ಇನ್ನೂ ಕೆಲವು ವಿಚಾರಗಳನ್ನು ಸಹ ಸ್ಪಷ್ಟವಾಗಿ ಅವರು ಉದಾಹರಣೆ ಮೂಲಕ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಉದಾಹರಣೆ, ಈಗ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಯಾವುದನ್ನು ಮಾಡಬಹುದು ಅಂತಂದರೆ, ಉದಾಹರಣೆ ಈಗ ಶಿಶುಪಾಲನೆ ಈ ಥರದ ವಿಚಾರಗಳ ಕುರಿತಾಗಿ, ಅಥವಾ ಸಾರ್ವಜನಿಕ ಒಂದು ಸುರಕ್ಷತೆ ಮತ್ತು ಸಾರ್ವಜನಿಕ ಸಾರಿಗೆ, ಈ ಥರದ್ದೆಲ್ಲವನ್ನೂ ಸಹ ಸಮರ್ಪಕವಾಗಿ ಆ ಸೇವೆಗಳನ್ನು ನೀಡಿದಾಗ ಮಹಿಳೆಯರು ಸಹ ಉದ್ಯೋಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಭಾಗವಹಿಸುವಿಕೆ, ಇವೆಲ್ಲವೂ ಸಹ ಸಮರ್ಪಕವಾಗಿ ಆಗೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಅವಕಾಶ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಎನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು. ಅಂದರೆ ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ಪಾತ್ರ ಎರಡು ರೀತಿಯಿಂದ ಪ್ರಮುಖವಾಗಿದೆ. ಒಂದು, ತಾನೇ ಉದ್ಯೋಗವನ್ನು ಸೃಜನೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು, ಮತ್ತು ಉದ್ಯೋಗ ಸೃಜನೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಒಂದು ವಾತಾವರಣ ನಿರ್ಮಾಣ ಮಾಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು. ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ವಿಭಾಗ ಅಂತಂದರೆ ಕಾರ್ಮಿಕರ ಒಂದು ಸಮಗ್ರ ಕಲ್ಯಾಣ, ಅದನ್ನು ಹೊರತುಪಡಿಸಿ ಇದಿಲ್ಲ, ಇವೆಲ್ಲವನ್ನು ಒಳಗೊಂಡಂತೆ ಆಗಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು. ಇವೆಲ್ಲವನ್ನು ಹೇಳಿದಾಗ ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ವಿಚಾರ ನನಗೆ ಅನಿಸ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ಅಂತಂತಂದರೆ, ಇದ್ರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಒಂದು ರೀತಿಯಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಒಂದು ರಿಸರ್ಚ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಡೆವಲಪ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಅಂತ ನಾವೇನು ಕೇಳ್ತೀವಿ, ಇದಕ್ಕೂ ಸಹ ಖಾಸಗಿ ವಲಯದಿಂದ ಹೆಚ್ಚಿನ ಒಂದು ಇನ್ವೆಸ್ಟ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಅದನ್ನು ಸಹ ಸರ್ಕಾರವೇ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾದಂಥ ಒಂದು ಪರಿಸ್ಥಿತಿ ಇದೆ. ಯಾಕೆಂತಂದರೆ ಅದನ್ನು ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಒಂದು ಏನು ಮಲ್ಟಿಪ್ಲೈಯರ್ ಎಫೆಕ್ಟ್ ಅಂತ ನಾವೇನು ಕೇಳ್ತೀವಿ, ಬಹುವಾಗಿ ಅದು ಪರಿಣಾಮಕಾರಿಯಾಗಿ ಆಗ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ಇದೆ. ಈ ರೀತಿ ಮಾಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದಾದಾಗ ಒಂದು ಸಮಗ್ರವಾದ ಏಳಿಗೆ ಮತ್ತು ಆರ್ಥಿಕ ಅಭಿವೃದ್ಧಿ ಎರಡೂ ಸಹ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು ಸ್ಪಷ್ಟವಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಒಂದು ವಿಚಾರ. ಕಡೆಯದಾಗಿ ಒಂದು ಹೇಳೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಇಷ್ಟಪಡ್ತೇನೆ, ಈ ರೀತಿಯಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನಗಳು ನಾವು ನಮ್ಮ ಇತಿಹಾಸದಲ್ಲೇ ಹೆಕ್ಕಿ ನೋಡಿದರೆ ಸಿಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಉದಾಹರಣೆ, ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಒಂದು ಆಡಳಿತವನ್ನು ತಗೊಂಡಾಗ ಇದನ್ನು ಅವರು ಪ್ರಸ್ತಾಪ ಮಾಡಿರಲಿಲ್ಲ, ಇದು ನನ್ನ ಒಂದು ಅನಿಸಿಕೆಯನ್ನು ಸಹ ಸೇರಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ. ನಾಲ್ವಡಿ ಕೃಷ್ಣರಾಜ ಒಡೆಯರ ನೀವು ಅವರ ಒಂದು ಆರ್ಥಿಕ ನೀತಿಯನ್ನು ತೆಗೆದುಕೊಂಡು ನೋಡಿದಾಗ ಕೃಷಿಗೆ ಉತ್ತೇಜನ ಕೊಟ್ಟರು, ಟಾಟಾ ಇನ್ಸ್ಟಿಟ್ಯೂಟ್ನ ಅಂಥ ಸಂಶೋಧನಾ ಸಂಸ್ಥೆಗಳನ್ನು ಸೃಜನೆ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು, ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕ ವಲಯದಲ್ಲಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕ ಪಿಡುಗುಗಳ ನಿವಾರಣೆಗೆ ಅಗತ್ಯ ಕ್ರಮಗಳನ್ನು ತಗೊಂಡ್ರು, ಮತ್ತು ಮಹಿಳೆಯರ ಶಿಕ್ಷಣಕ್ಕೆ ಒತ್ತು ಕೊಟ್ಟರು. ಇವೆಲ್ಲವನ್ನು ಮಾಡಿ 1940ರಲ್ಲಿ ದೇಶದ ಅತಿ ಎರಡನೆಯ ಶ್ರೀಮಂತ ಪ್ರಜೆಯಾಗಿ ಅವ್ರು ನಿಂತಿದ್ರು. ಅಂದರೆ ಇವೆಲ್ಲವನ್ನೂ ಸಹ ಸಮರ್ಪಕವಾಗಿ ಮಾಡೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥ ಜ್ವಲಂತ ನಿದರ್ಶನ ನಮ್ಮಲ್ಲಿದೆ. ಆ ರೀತಿ ಮಾಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಒಂದು ಅವಕಾಶ ಮತ್ತು ಅನಿವಾರ್ಯತೆ ಕೂಡ ಇದೆ. ಇದು ರಾಜಕೀಯ ಚೌಕಟ್ಟಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಮುನ್ನಡಿಬೇಕಾದಂಥ ಒಂದು ಅವಶ್ಯಕತೆ ಇದೆ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದನ್ನು ಸ್ಪಷ್ಟವಾಗಿ ಉದಾಹರಣೆ ಸಹಿತ ಅವರು ನಿರೂಪಣೆ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಯಾವುದೇ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳಿದ್ರೂ ಸಹ ಅವರು ಉತ್ತರಿಸೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಸಿದ್ಧ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ನನ್ನ ಮಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ತಿಳಿದಂತೆ ಇದನ್ನ ಅನುವಾದ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು.
Thank you, Mr. Madhusudan, for summarizing the lecture of Amit Basole so beautifully for us. Now we will take the next 15 minutes for the Q&A session. I only would like to request to keep your questions short so that we can hear from everyone. Also, we would like to bunch some questions together, and that's how Mr. Basole is going to answer. Yes. Please, can you pass the mic to gentleman at third row from my right.
ಆನ್ ಆಗಿದೆಯಾ?
Rini, third row, first.
Thank you. You mentioned about the need for decentralized development with local to meet the local needs, local demands, and that kind of a development. I have in mind what government of Karnataka did sometimes in 70s and 80s. That is. Watershed-based integrated rural development. Water being the the most critical point, and conservation of water on watershed basis, and the integrated rural development involving agriculture, horticulture, animal husbandry, and local small-scale industries, and the credit being the most important factor in all this. There was, the local credit system of people contributing and, generating this credit facility needed for this. And I remember I served in the forest department. I see that there was a rural prosperity, there was a lot of employment, and there was a general development at the local level. And should this not be, it is not that government has to invest a large amount of money in this, it is only facilitation. And then I have seen that Mairada organization has done a marvelous job in this. I have seen in Kamalapura in Gulbarga district, and there's one in Kolar. It is a model rural development and employment generation, productivity. All this is addressed. Should not this be a model of development all over India? I personally feel that is going to generate a lot of employment and give income, and then make rural communities self-dependent. Can you please comment on this?
Can I ask? Thank you, Mr. Amit. I think it was very insightful. My name is Balu. I am from CGS. I have two quick questions. You talked about the government jobs being so benevolent that there's a 1:5 differentiation in pay. It's same job, same role, but they're 5 times overpaid. First question is, any practical suggestions on correcting that? Because there is money shortage for hiring so many people. Unless productivity, efficiency is embedded, this problem is perennial. The second question is, recently I think coming to power is all about freebies now. Right? It's a political economy that is throwing freebies. Are they killing jobs? Are they killing incentive and the urge to work? Because people, third generation, fourth generation, people in farming want to see their lands appreciate, but they want to probably migrate to cities and do very low-end jobs because the basic necessities are taken care by freebies. I'm probably generalizing this, but this is fast appearing as a trend.
Are we getting into some kind of a middle income trap? Costs are going up, productivity is low, debt is high, rich are getting richer, poor are getting poorer.
Thank you. Okay, so let me address very briefly on the first question. Yes, I mean, I think, there are any number, I think, of such models that have been tried, and we need to do that. I would 100% agree. In fact, I'm not knowledgeable about many of these things. And I think, what comes to mind hearing this is sort of that I'm going to make a mess of this, but we've forgotten more things than other countries know, right? So you just try so many things and then we forget about it, and it's there somewhere. So I don't know what is the way to raise them into visibility and make a national program out of these kinds of things, but it is definitely needed. I agree with you that. On government salaries, yeah, so here's my chance to backpedal a little bit. Because one of the things I realized after saying all this is it's just not good form to criticize someone who earns much less than I do for getting paid a lot. So if I were to do my job elsewhere, I'd be earning a quarter of my income. I'm aware of that. Right? So, but just aside, there is a real problem here. We don't have enough revenue generation to provide the service, and this goes back to my point about being democracy as well. Being a democracy, universal franchise, all of that places certain demands on welfare, on provisioning, etc., which makes demands on revenue. You need to have that revenue to deliver those things. Now, if you're also going to pay people a lot of money, then there's just an obvious trade-off there. Now, how do you effectively do this in a politically feasible way? The solution that we have found is that we stop hiring at those gazetted wages and we hire in the open market on contract, effectively creating a dual workforce everywhere. This is our solution everywhere, not just public sector but also private sector. If you're a firm and you have legacy employees who you pay high, new employees you will pay here. So you'll have two people doing the same work, one getting paid half or less of what the other is getting paid. Obviously this is not a good solution. But without creating losers, this is the only solution. And I don't have an answer to that, because any actual reduction in wages is, I don't think, going to happen. So at most you can expect a grandfathering. Effectively what we are doing, which is that you stop hiring at those wages and you only hire at lower wages, so that in 20 years when all the old people are gone, you're only happy. That seems to be the way we have decided to solve this problem. I can't claim to have any better way of solving it. We could do better in terms of the new people being paid not at the rock bottom. I think the exemplar role of government is important here, which is that we do better than the market because we'd like the market to meet here. We just don't do 5 times better than it. Maybe we do 50% more or 100% more, not 500% more. But I don't have any solutions here. On freebies, see, this is a complicated thing and I think it will take time to really sort it out. I think that term itself is, kind of invoked for the kinds of transfers that we don't like and not for the transfers we do, and we need to be clear about what transfers are worthwhile transfers to do and what are not. Right? Now, I don't think, and I haven't studied this carefully, that we are at the point where we are seriously killing incentives to invest in human capital and work if that work is remunerated. Now, this is the key, that if you are looking at a 15,000 rupee job, I'm not sure that you're going to do it. But if you can be offered a 40,000 rupee job, you might. So the job creation of those kinds, I think, is the way to respond to this. The welfare pressures will remain. I don't see that going away in the kind of political setup we have. At most, what you can do is better targeting and all these things that we are very familiar with. But I don't see it going away. And so the practical solution, I think, is to create opportunities where people would want to invest and go, rather than not doing it. Finally, on the middle income trap. So for those who don't know, this is a term that is used for countries that find themselves in the sort of 10 to 15,000 rupee maybe dollar per year kind of category. Brazil, other places like this. Brazil is probably a little bit more than that. Potentially China, Mexico, other places where you don't grow beyond it. But more importantly, macroeconomically, you're not stable anymore. So you refer to high debt and so on. So you're not able to actually sustain a well-functioning economy, not able to grow, etc. Now we are far from being there because we are not middle income. So we need to at least grow 4 times before we have that problem. And as I said, I'll be very happy to have that problem because we are poor, and I don't see a lot of problem with it except for the macroeconomic stability part. I mean, that I agree, but there I think we are, our legacy is so different. I mean, India has been so much better governed macroeconomically than many Latin American countries, other middle income countries have. We are much more conservative. The RBI is very conservative when it comes to external sector stuff. Fiscal deficits have hardly been skyrocketing except for exceptional things. Inflation has almost never reached the kinds of rates that that doesn't mean that it won't, but I think we are just a different country and we don't need to be scared of it. You could do one more round if you have to.
Yeah, just a minute.
Hello.
Yeah, if there are any questions in Kannada, my colleagues Madhusudan and Moin will translate them, and we'll take 3 questions at one round. So, ma'am, you can start, and then sir, you can please. I'm really sorry, she had the mic.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. Given the level of unemployment that we see, why are we allowing children who are 14 years old to get into the labor force without any skills? And we are trying to catch them later and skill them and so on. So isn't there a reason to keep children in the school until they are 18 years and at the same time give them some skill training on a compulsory basis before we let them loose into the labor force? That's one question. The second one is, in the context of framing a Karnataka labor policy, I happen to be part of that committee. So the MSMEs are demanding that they should be exempted from payment of minimum wages. They should be exempted from ESIC and EPF because they just cannot survive if they have to stick to those norms. So how do we enable them to be able to pay their workers a decent wage and give them social security? Because that will enable the large sector of unorganized workers to have better life and also create demand at the bottom level, which is missing right now, and their wages will also increase. So how do we help the MSMEs to fulfill the norms? Thank you.
Sir, I am a layman. My question may look very silly for the people, August audience here. What would be the technological advancement and the AI impact on the employment generation? Number 1. Number 2, is there any possibility by paying higher wages to the skilled labor and skilled knowledge people are leaving the country and going abroad and settling because of the attractive salaries? These are my 2 questions.
You can take one more.
One at the back.
So you mentioned that quotas and reservations in the private sector are difficult. Could you expand a bit on that and tell us why?
Yeah. Thanks. Okay, so unemployment and child labor, see the thing here is that these are 2 different groups of people, right? So unemployment in India is basically concentrated almost entirely among college educated young people. So if you look at the unemployment rate, if you go beyond the age of 29 or 30 years old, it's very low number. It's like 2% or 3%. And if you look at those who don't have college degrees, again it's a very low number, 3 or 4%, 5%. Those large unemployment rates that you hear about are entirely college educated people between the years of 21 and 28. Coming out of college and getting married is when people can afford to be unemployed, and they can afford to be unemployed only if their parents are willing to pay for their unemployment. So that creates a very, very narrow group of people who are there. Child labor there's a different set of people altogether who actually need those children to work. for household expenses. So if you want to reduce that incidence, then you need to think of a way to incentivize parents to keep children out of the labor force for those few years and complete schooling. So free schooling, maybe direct income transfers if you feel that people need those to keep children out. It's not, you can't have those who are unemployed do this work, they will not be willing. If they were willing to do it, they wouldn't be unemployed. Right? The MSME question is an excellent one, and I'm very excited to know that you're on this committee. I think Professor Rajesh Joseph from APU is also there, and I had some conversations with him about it, and it's excellent work, and it's a good question. Now, I am not qualified to answer this question. I'll just hazard some guesses. One thing, of course, on an information side, it's always good if the government has very clear visibility on finances to know if employers are trying to pull a fast one on you or they are genuinely constrained. Because no employer wants to do this, right? No matter how well off they are. They need to be convinced and sometimes forced. That doesn't mean that MSMEs don't have a genuine problem. They may have problems of margins and profits and profitability. They may be constrained in so many ways that add to their expenses, which they think this is an additional burden, I don't want to deal with it. Perfectly reasonable thing to say, in which case the only practical solution I imagine is it's a quid pro quo, which is that we'll give you this, you have to give us this. Right? So here's what we are doing to make life easy for you. Maybe not free power, but something else. We can talk about free power as a potential issue, but something that makes life easier for them, that they feel is a constraint that can be addressed by the government, in exchange for which they agree to come on board and give this one thing to workers, right? So that they don't feel like they're giving away a concession without getting anything in return. What that thing in return will be depends very much on the sectors and so on. That's my very broad answer. I know it's not a good answer, but the best I can come up with. On AI, some people I know would be very offended that I gave an entire talk on employment without mentioning AI even once, or even automation. Doesn't mean I don't take it seriously. It obviously is there, and many jobs, including mine, are, if not on the chopping block, significantly altered by its existence. But I can't do justice to it now, so you'll forgive me for not addressing this question. I will say, please don't read those reports that say 500 million jobs are going to disappear in the next 5 years. Nobody knows that. They're just, sort of fancy clickbaits. There are very few people who actually have a concrete idea of what's going to happen. It is going to change things. Okay? But I'm trying to see if I can answer this without getting into the history of tech. There have been many moments in our history in the last 200 years when we've felt that the latest technology is going to destroy jobs. It hasn't happened. Okay? So that's what I'll say about that. Brain drain, to make it short, what you said, great for them. Let them go. Right? We have lots of people. In fact, one of the solutions to our thing which I didn't mention is export people. Right? That's what other people did, and it worked fine for them. I'm partly jesting. What I mean is that it's not a zero-sum game where we had 10 good people and they left. Right? First of all, we have lots if we invest in them. There'll be many. They will not be able to go anywhere because they don't have the resources. Right? So they are trapped here. And they're available to work. Quotas in the private sector, yeah, I mean, the problem is that you've got a open market. India is a free market. You can relocate wherever, right? So it's not, states can't do this because businesses will react by relocating where they can. And so unlike workers, businesses have more resources to relocate. So they will leave and so forth. So you have potential problems to worry about there. But also you have problems of implementation. Who is going to enforce these quotas? Are they being met or not? Any number of difficult issues to what end I'm not very sure. Right? I think it's better to do it a little indirectly, especially if you're talking about regionals. If you're talking about caste, that's a different issue. Right? So specifically on caste-based quotas, I think they haven't even been tried in the private sector. The only thing that has been tried is region-based quotas, and that doesn't seem to work for obvious reasons of relocation. If there was somehow miraculously a national quota in the private sector on caste, that would be an interesting thing. Right? That doesn't have that obvious problem of businesses just reacting by moving. You can't do that. I don't know that it's politically very, very difficult to do, obviously. I don't see them working very easily. I think there are other ways to address the disparities that we see. They will take longer. There are more bottom-up ways of ensuring that workers are better prepared and that growth is enough, what I said earlier, which is that employers don't have the luxury of discrimination. That's a sustainable way of addressing it, but I know it's a slow way of doing it. So, thank you. I think we're out of time.
No. I think there was this one question at the back. There are a couple more. Yeah. Yeah, one more round, just 3 questions. Yep. So, can you pass the mic to that gentleman in the back?
My question is partly addressed by sir in the previous comment, so you can pass on to another.
Okay, thank you. At the front, these two.
Thank you for thought-provoking as well as a provoking lecture. I'll come to the provocation on democracy that you mentioned and you've brought it up again. I can understand the pressure for welfare measures and so-called freebies on political, but why has there been no pressure on the issue of employment generation? Quite to the contrary, we have seen the central government take various measures where there has been job reduction, you're talking about demonetization, GST, etc., without any political fallout. And of course, it's arguable whether the diminishing democracy here is actually leading to any of the positive steps towards amelioration, which was your argument.
Hello, so this was a wonderful lecture. So I have 2 questions. The first question is that you talked about in the policy that you would like job creation in the salaried employment category. So I just wanted you to talk a bit more about what impact it has on the self-employment and casual laborer category as well, like the channels through which it can affect. One channel is when you said that there has to be an increase in like infrastructure and making of roads. So casual laborers will be required for that, so through that channel. And the second question is about when you talked about state taking care of child care. So the question I had is that with the current norms, even when state takes the responsibility of child care, it will be mostly women who do that job. So how does this delegation of child care responsibility from one woman at a position in power to another woman actually change the status of the labor market discrimination based on identities?
So I think there was a book that came out recently called Degrowth Manifesto, which is about saying that capitalism, whatever you try to do is not going to work, whether you focus on the GDP or not, etc. And they advocate for a complete overhaul of saying that we need to degrow. So what is your take on that?
So first on why is employment not sufficiently a politically salient issue, I think was the question. That's a good question. Every time there's some election or something around, some journalists come and ask, do you think it's going to be an issue? And if polls are to be believed, and it is. But so unemployment, I'm not surprised at all, is not an important issue. Go back to who I mentioned is affected by it. Right? For 5 years in your life, you care about it if you are you. And your parents maybe care about it. It's a transitory phenomenon. It's a huge waste to the country to have millions of people sit around and study for exams for 3 years for positions they are not going to get. That's a problem for us as a society, but I don't see it rising to the political salience in that same way. Right? And the rest of the employment problem is a problem of basically wages and working conditions. Now, those again, unless you have a very different working class politics with unions being large enough to drive the political debate and so forth, I don't see it happening. If that happens, then yes. Right? If we have large, for example, if we have large informal sector unions, which have millions of people as members and are taken seriously by political parties, and they say, well, why aren't you doing this or whatever, then I think it can happen. But otherwise it's too fragmented and felt in very different ways. Of course, there's also an intense personalization of it on part of people. They don't see it as a structural or an economic issue, they see it as a personal issue. It's a personal failing, I am unlucky, I am unskilled, whatever. So that's also something you have to work on to raise consciousness that you're not unemployed because it's your fault. Right? That's a natural way of thinking about it. Yeah, so my focus was on salaried as an aspirational part. That's where we would like to go. But of course, on the way there, government spending is going to create many kinds of employment, including casual labor, mainly because infrastructure is often done that way. My peeve is against self-employment, right? And against sort of this trotting out of, we've given you a 10,000 rupee loan and that's how we are going to solve the unemployment. That's just garbage. What you're doing when you're doing that is dividing a fixed amount of demand among 5 producers instead of earlier being divided among 3 producers. So to caricature it, you will be selling dosas to the same 100 people, but now there are 5 people selling dosas on carts instead of 2 people. So earlier 2 people had 50 customers each, now 5 people have 20 each. What is that? Right? So that's the kind of problem that we need to think differently from there. Right? But of course, other employment will get generated. Your second question, I think, is really the thing, and as I was talking about it, I was aware of this, that who is going to provide the childcare? Obviously women. And what we have seen in developed countries is these, what are called these transnational care chains, where poor women from other countries travel to rich countries so that rich country women can go and work. And it's an established system that works very well. Right? You go to the US, any number of childcare centers and so on, all manned by Asian and Latin American women. I don't have an answer to this except to say that perhaps we can think of it as a transitory phenomenon. What do I mean by that? That women who need to have some flexible short-term hours and so on perhaps do this job to free up women who actually have the skills, capacities and willingness to do longer jobs who are constrained by childcare. You know what I mean? So these are different women we're talking about. And in fact, you're creating jobs for 2 different kinds of women, right? Just like in the US, you're creating one class of jobs for the Guatemalan women who are looking after the women who go to work in the Wall Street banks, right? Now, this is not an ideal situation. It's not a final situation. But it could be a transition thing. I realize it's not ideal. The best thing to do, of course, is for men to both provide childcare at home, reducing the overall need for childcare, and provide childcare professionally as well. And I don't think that is impossible. Norms need to shift and so forth, but that can be done. Lastly, degrowth. This is a good question to perhaps end on, because it's a big kind of issue, systemic issue. And I said at the beginning that my ambitions are very modest. So I stayed away from any of these kinds of systemic things. I think that stopping growing and shrinking, statistically speaking, is a good prescription for those who are above average in global per capita GDP. So if you imagine the distribution of global per capita GDP, we are at the left of the average. Let's say China maybe somewhere around, I don't know what the average is right now, but maybe a little bit to the right, and then America is way to the right. All those who are on the right, be my guest and reduce. All those who are on the left should not listen to this, because you're on the left of the average. Right? So grow. And the others should shrink. They really should, because they have far overstayed their welcome in terms of resources and so on, right? Now that's another very difficult political problem. We are not going to solve it sitting here, but we certainly should not be listening to any advice of this kind from Europe and America is my view. If we feel that we need to grow in a different way and do a service to the world by not replicating that model, we should do it. I think we must do it. But that's because we feel, pardon the Hindi, hum log ehsan karenge un pe. No, we will do a favor to the world by imagining that, not because you are asking us to do it. I think there's a very big difference here, and we should do it. Everybody knows that we can't replicate what China and America did. That ship has sailed. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Basole. That was a very engaging Q&A session, and I hope all of your questions got answered. I would like to dedicate all of the remaining time to honor the person in whose name we are actually hosting these lectures. So just to give you a little bit of history, the first lecture of this series was held on 11th May 2010, right exactly at this hall. Ever since then, we have been organizing this lecture almost every year in the memory of Dr. Poornima VYASULU, one of our founding members, as an endowment lecturer at the Institute of World Culture, Bangalore. As you all know, Dr. Poornima VYASULU was instrumental in setting up the Center for Budget and Policy Studies. She contributed not just intellectually to its development, but also nourished a working sense of care and camaraderie here. She earned her MBA from Indian Institute of Management, IIM Bangalore, and she finished her PhD from IIT Delhi. So her interests were not just academic, we all know that. She was heavily into theatre and music, and her legacy reflects all of these. From the conversations I've had with my colleagues, Dr. Poornima VYASULU was known for her diversity of interest and capabilities, ranging from music to theatre on one side to health and gender on another. Her commitment to work was unwavering. Even through her illness, she endured. She used to she was a fiercely independent woman, so she used to go to her dialysis by herself. She used to stay at the night in the hospital, and then she used to come back to work in the morning here. Through her illness, she finished the study of Panchayati Raj in Andhra Pradesh and West Bengal. More closely, her legacy to us comes through a daily act of care, which is one bowl of fruit. Poornima VYASULU wanted to make sure that we had something to eat, the employees in the office, we had something to eat between our lunch and dinner. So she started a tradition of providing one bowl of fruit to us between after lunch and between our dinner, the time we go away from the organization, basically. So if you are lucky enough and come to the office in that magical hour, you will be handed a bowl of fruit by Rameshanna. So that is a reminder of the daily act of care that Poornima VYASULU and her legacy that she has left on us, and we endure that. I'm sure you all have very, very fond and wonderful memories of her. So for the next session, I would like to invite Mr. Jagdish to speak a little bit about her. And Mr. Jagdish was the teacher of Poornima VYASULU. And Mr. Jagdish, please, if you can join us and tell us about Poornima VYASULU. I invite anyone else who would like to speak about Dr. Poornima VYASULU. My only request is to just introduce yourself a little bit before the start.
Thank you. Greetings, fellow companions at whatever time it was of Dr. Poornima VYASULU. Being a little inclined towards spirituality, I believe and hope that Poornima is out there listening to us. Existentialists, particularly of the kind of Sartre and Heidegger, spoke about finitude. Finitude is that when you focus on a particular thing and leave out the rest of infinite possibilities, you are in this, create this finitude. Heidegger particularly talked about the finitude of life, which is like a river into which you are thrown. And you could just float around that river until that finitude passes, or you can learn to swim different strokes and create a ripple that affects others. Michael Singer was an economist, but ended up setting up a huge software company which were responsible for creating a large platform for all the medical supplies and medicines to be available at any point of time to clinics and hospitals in the US. He spoke about what is called the surrendering experiment. When you speak of surrendering, there are two kinds of surrender. One, of course, where you surrender to what is happening around you because of a helplessness. But Singer didn't talk about that surrendering. He spoke about how he himself grew to be so big by the word surrendering, which is accepting something, both good and adverse, so that having accepted that, you get a more creative attitude to do things to overcome your adversities and create a world, a meaningful world. Then we have Richard Bach, who in his book Illusion said, you are never given a desire without the ability to achieve it, but you have to work for it. The reason I brought these three people, and of course many more I could do, is because Poornima VYASULU was an epitome of a being in all these three facets of life. She just didn't swim in this finitude of life. She did things. She accepted adversity, but knew how to handle it, and she handled it extremely well. Thirdly, of course, she had a lot of desire to grow personally, a lot of interest, and achieved all of that because she knew how to work for it. I remember this particularly when she was my student. It so happened when she was a student, I was only a research fellow. I was not yet a faculty, I was not yet a professor at that time. But I was given the opportunity to teach independently a course on operations research. Now, having myself been a graduate from IIM Ahmedabad, I had all the arrogance of that elite generation. And my expectation, of course, of others was so high that I didn't hold these people in high regard. As a teacher, I assume they'll definitely be less of what they're capable of. Now, Poornima was not a very brilliant student, but a very capable and above average student. And given that she was from the arts background and I was teaching operations research, I didn't expect much of her anyway. But two very interesting incidents happened. Being the arrogant person that I was, the test that I gave was actually about a very advanced linear programming situation using combinatorial mathematics, which was about scheduling using combinatorial linear programming, etc. I had discussed this in class, and I used this, my pride, and of course all teachers do that. They want to clone themselves. So I had used that as a question in one of my test. I was pleasantly surprised, and so all teachers definitely are pleasantly surprised when their students do well, that Poornima scored very well in that test. The second situation is what I said, either part of this test or I think we had a Viva, separate Viva. So I was also on the panel before whom she appeared for a Viva. Again, I asked her questions because of my area of quantitative methods, and again I was pleasantly surprised that she did extremely well. My regard, my respect for her definitely went up. Not that I didn't admire her earlier because of her grit for having decided to get into an IIM Bangalore and having succeeded very well. During those very few, there are only 3 IIMs and not an easy thing to get into an IIM, and having done very well. Once having got into it, she could have just, and later on I learned that she went further up and did her PhD. Then she started this institute, and many of her human activities, human attitude that it so happened I had the advantage of being in touch with her even as she started a career. She went away from IIM on and off. Probably I was just to have the opportunity to get in touch with her more than my colleague, her husband, VYASULU. We were apart because I'm a non-economist and he was an economist. And I didn't believe in economists. So this is one person I admired a lot, who, as I've already mentioned, used her grit, her ability, her ambition, everything grow, not herself. When a person grows oneself, the universe grows with it. As part of a larger frame, like I said, I believe more spirituality. One of the astrophysicists used a very, I should say, a nasty term for all of us. She called us all galactic poo. So that's what we are. But whatever we do, definitely, positively, definitely results in the growth of the universe itself, which again needs to take care of you. And that's what Poornima did. And I'm grateful to have been called here to speak this little introduction about her. Outside, of course, we can talk a lot about her. That's enough. I think for the moment you get the message. Thank you, Poornima. Thank you all.
I request anyone else who would like to come up and speak about Dr. Poornima VYASULU. Yes, you can just raise your hands, then the mic shall come to you. Magical mic shall appear. If there is, please raise your hands. Do they want to speak? Let's check.
Yeah, go there.
Oh.
I was touched by what Professor Jagdish said just now. I am a classmate. We joined in 1975, roughly 48, 49 years back. MBA. Some of my colleagues, classmates are also here. My memory goes off like this because the first semester we had a mix of people from all over the place, north, south, engineers, non-engineers, IITs, non-IITs, Kannadigas, South Indians, North Indians and all that. And we quickly polarized into some different groups. And there were a lot of conflicts. And the polarizing thing was the election for the class representative. elections have a way of polarizing people, we all know that. And there's only one person who was acceptable to all. And she was so calm, so nice, she was so very friendly with all the people. I have shared this with many people on many occasions. And this still stands in my consciousness. She was such a good person. She brought the class to a kind of a cohesive group in a matter of just 2 months. In first semester, we were fighting with each other, backbiting, all sorts of things. And this was a person who was acceptable to all. She was such a good personality. And today also, in fact, I have shared on many forums, in fact, I've shared some experience with her, like we were together in some projects. She was also involved in some theatre where she acted very well. In fact, so many, and every year, in fact, a memory like this brings, which is already there in our consciousness, okay? She will be always with her consciousness in our classmates. Thank you, okay?
If there is anyone else who would like to speak about, please raise your hand and the magical mic. Okay, if you want to come, please. Please come.
ಇಲ್ಲಿರೋರೆಲ್ಲ IIM, IIT ಆ ಥರ ನಮಗೆ ಅರ್ಥನೇ ಆಗದೆ ಇರೋಂಥ ಇಂಗ್ಲೀಷ್ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾ ಇರೋರು. ತುಂಬ ರಿಸರ್ಚ್ ಬೇಸ್ಡಾಗಿ ನೀವು ಪೂರ್ಣಿಮಾ ಬಗ್ಗೆ, CBPS ಬಗ್ಗೆ, ಕಂಟೆಂಟ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ದೀರಾ. ನನಗೆ ಪೂರ್ಣಿಮಾ ನೀವು ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರಲ್ಲ, ಥಿಯೇಟರ್, ಆರ್ಟ್, ಕಲ್ಚರ್ ಅಂತ, ಆ ಬ್ಯಾಕ್ಗ್ರೌಂಡಿಂದ ನನಗೆ ಪರಿಚಯ ಆಗಿತ್ತು. ತುಂಬ ಹಿಂದೆ ಬೆನಕ ಗ್ರೂಪಲ್ಲಿ ಮೋಲಿಯರ್ದು ಒಂದು ನಾಟಕ ಇತ್ತು, ಕಾಗೆ ಕುಣಿತ ಅಂತ. ಬೆನಕ ನಿಮಗೆಲ್ಲ ಗೊತ್ತಿರೋ ಹಾಗೆ ಕಾರಂತರು ಹುಟ್ಟು ಹಾಕಿದ್ದು. ನಾನು ಸ್ಟೂಡೆಂಟ್ ಆಗಿದ್ದೆ, ಇನ್ನೂ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಇಯರ್ ಡಿಗ್ರಿ LLBನಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ದೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ನಂದು ಕೂಡ ಒಂದು ಒನ್ ಆಫ್ ದ ಬೆಸ್ಟ್ ಸಪೋರ್ಟಿಂಗ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟರ್ಸಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನು ಕೂಡ ಇದ್ದೆ. ಪೂರ್ಣಿಮಾನೂ ಇದ್ದರು. ಅವರು ಫಸ್ಟು ನನಗೆ ಪರಿಚಯ ಆದಾಗ ನನಗೆ ಬೇರೆ ಫ್ರೆಂಡ್ಸು, ಥಿಯೇಟ್ರ್ ಫ್ರೆಂಡ್ಸು, ಪ್ರಾಬಬಲಿ ವೈಶಾಲಿ ಅನಿಸುತ್ತೆ, ಪೂರ್ಣಿಮಾ ವಿಷ್ಣು ತಂಗಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದು. ನನಗೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಆಂಟನ, ಓ ವಿಷ್ಣುವರ್ಧನ್ ತಂಗಿ ಅಂತ. ಅದು ಸೆಕೆಂಡರಿ ಆಯಿತು. ವಿಷ್ಣು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹಿಂದೆ ಹೋದರು. ಪೂರ್ಣಿಮಾ ಒಬ್ಬ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟರಾಗಿ, ಒಬ್ಬ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿಯಾಗಿ ಪರಿಚಯ ಆದರು, ಫ್ರೆಂಡಲ್ಲ. ಆಮೇಲೆ ನಾನು ಜರ್ನಲಿಸಮ್ಗೆ ಬಂದ ಮೇಲೆ ಮತ್ತು ಕೆಲವು ಮೀಡಿಯಾ ಫೆಲೋಶಿಪ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ರಿಪ್ರೊಡಕ್ಟಿವ್ ರಿಸರ್ಚ್ದು ಮೀಡಿಯಾದು ಫೋರ್ಡ್ ಫೌಂಡೇಶನ್ಗೆ ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ನನಗೆ ಅವ್ರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ತುಂಬ ಕ್ಲೋಸ್ ಕಾಂಟ್ಯಾಕ್ಟ್ ಬರೋಕ್ಕೆ ಶುರುವಾಯಿತು. ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ನಾನು ಅನ್ಆರ್ಗನೈಸ್ ಸೆಕ್ಟರ್ದು RCH ರಿಪ್ರೊಡಕ್ಟಿವ್ ಹೆಲ್ತದ್ದು ತೆಗೆದುಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಿತ್ತು. ಶಮಂತ ನೀನು ಹಿಂಗೆ ಮಾಡು, ಶಮಂತ ನೀನು ಹಂಗೆ ಮಾಡು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಿದ್ದು. ಮತ್ತು ನಾನು ಅದನ್ನು ಬೆಂಗಳೂರು, ಮೈಸೂರು, ಆಲ್ ಓವರ್ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕನ ತೆಗೆದುಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದೆ. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಫೈನಲಿ ಎಷ್ಟರ ಮಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಅವರು ಅದನ್ನು ಅಕಾಡೆಮಿಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ಒಂದು ಜರ್ನಲಿಸ್ಟ್ಗೆ ನಾವು ರಿಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡೋದು 5000 ವರ್ಡ್ಸ್, 4000 ವರ್ಡ್ಸ್ ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಅದನ್ನು ಟಾರ್ಗೆಟ್ ಮಾಡಿರ್ತೀವಿ, ನಮ್ದು ಏನು ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಆ ರಿಸರ್ಚ್ ರಿಪೋರ್ಟ್ನ. ಅವರು ಎಷ್ಟು ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಅದನ್ನು ಸಿಸ್ಟಮ್ಯಾಟಿಕಲಿ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಒಂದು ಸ್ಟೈಲ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು ಅಂದರೆ, ಫೈನಲಿ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಹೆಲ್ತ್ ಟಾಸ್ಕ್ ಫೋರ್ಸ್ ಇನ್ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ H. ಸುದರ್ಶನ್ ಅದನ್ನು ಹೆಡ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಿತ್ತು. ಅವ್ರು ಕಂಪ್ಲೀಟ್ ರಿಪೋರ್ಟ್ ರೆಡಿ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ನಾನು ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಕನ್ವಿನ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಲಾಸ್ಟ್ ಮಿನಿಟಲ್ಲಿ, SM ಕೃಷ್ಣ ವಾಸ್ ದ CM, ಲಾಸ್ಟ್ ಮಿನಿಟಲ್ಲಿ ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಮಹಿಳೆಯರ ಆರೋಗ್ಯ ಸಂತಾನೋತ್ಪತ್ತಿ ಹಾಕ್ಸಿದ್ವಿ. ಸೊ ಅದನ್ನು ನನಗೆ ಯಾವತ್ತಿಗೂ ನಂಗೆ ಮರೆಯೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಆಗೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ನಾನು ಕೆಲವು ನಮ್ಮದು ಡೆವಲಪ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಜರ್ನಲಿಸಮ್ ಸೆಕ್ಟಾರ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲವು ಹೇಳಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಆಲ್ವೇಸ್ ಐ ಕೋಟ್ ದಿಸ್ ಆ್ಯಸ್ ಅನ್ ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್. ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟು ಡಯಾಲಿಸಿಸ್ ಅಂತ ನೀವು ಯಾರೋ ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ರಿ. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಅವರು ನನಗೆ ಯೋಗ ಫ್ರೆಂಡ್ ಆದರು, ಪರ್ಸ್ನಲ್ ಫ್ರೆಂಡ್ ಆದರು, ತುಂಬ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ವಿ. ಆ ಡಯಾಲಿಸಿಸ್ದು ಕೂಡ ಅಷ್ಟೇ, ನಾನೇ ಹೋಗ್ತೀನಿ ಶಮಂತ, ಎಲ್ಲ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ನನಗೆ ಡಯಾಲಿಸಿಸಲ್ಲಿ ಮಲಗಬೇಕಾಗ್ದಾರೆ ಮತ್ತೆ ನನಗೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಇಂಟ್ರಾಸ್ಪೆಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋ ಹಾಗಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ನಾನು ಯಾಕೆ ಇಷ್ಟು ಕಷ್ಟಪಟ್ಕೊಂಡೆಲ್ಲ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ, ನನಗೆ ಏನಾದರೂ ಒಂದು ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿರೋ ಹಾಗೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಾಯಿದ್ರು. ತುಂಬ ಹಿಂಸೆ ಆಗ್ತಾಯಿತ್ತು. ನಾನು ಮಾತು ಟಾಪಿಕ್ ಚೇಂಜ್ ಮಾಡಿಬಿಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೆ. ಮತ್ತು ಅವರು ಬೇಸಿಕಲಿ ಆರ್ಟ್ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಅಂತ ನಿಮಗೆ ಸೂಪರ್ಫಿಷಿಯಲಿ ಗೊತ್ತು. ನನಗೆ ಆರ್ಟ್ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಆ ಥರದ್ದು ಅಂದರೆ ಒಂದು ಹ್ಯೂಮನ್ ಇಂಟ್ರೆಸ್ಟ್ ಮತ್ತು ಒಂದು ಹ್ಯೂಮನ್ ರಿಲೇಷನ್ಶಿಪ್ಪಲ್ಲಿ ನನಗೆ ಅವರು ಗೊತ್ತಿತ್ತು. ನಾಟ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ದಿ ಸೆರೆಬ್ರಲ್, ಓನ್ಲಿ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಹಾರ್ಟಲ್ಲಿ ಎಮೋಷ್ನಲ್ ಆಗಿ ನನಗೆ ಅವರು ಪರಿಚಯ ಇದ್ದಿತ್ತು. ಇನ್ನೂ ಒಂದು ನನಗೆ ತುಂಬ ಮರೆಯೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ, ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ತುಂಬ ಪ್ಲ್ಯಾಟ್ಫಾರ್ಮ್ಸಲ್ಲಿ ಆನರ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾಯಿದ್ರು. ಒಂದು ಕಡೆಗೆ ನಂಗೆ ಅದು ಮರ್ತೋಗಿದೆ ಆ ಕಾಂಟೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಯಾವುದು ಅಂತ. ಅವರ ಹೆಲ್ಪರ್ನ, ಡೊಮೆಸ್ಟಿಕ್ ಹೆಲ್ಪರ್ನ ಕರ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗಿದ್ದಂತೆ. ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ ಕರ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಇವ್ರಿಗೆ ಆನರ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಇವ್ರಿಗೇನೇನು ಶಾಲ್ ಎಕ್ಸೆಟ್ರಾ ಕೊಟ್ಟರು, ಆಕೆನ ಕರೆದು ಸ್ಟೇಜಲ್ಲಿ, ಸಪೋಸ್ ನಾನು ಏನಾದರೂ ಇವತ್ತು ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ಅಂದರೆ ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಹರ್. ನಾನು ಫಸ್ಟು ಆಕೆಗೆ ಮಾಡ್ತೀನಿ ಅಂತ. ಇದಿಷ್ಟು ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪೀರಿಯನ್ಸಸ್ಸು ಸಮ್ ಇಯರ್ಸ್ ಬ್ಯಾಕ್ ನನಗಾಗಿದ್ದಿತ್ತು. ಅಂದರೆ ನನಗೆ ಒಂಥರ ಸಾರ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಅಫ್ಕೋರ್ಸ್ ನಾನು ಒಂದು ಮೆಚೂರ್ಡ್ ಏಜಲ್ಲೇ ಇದ್ದೇ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತಲ್ಲ, ಆದರೆ ಈ ಥರ ಸಣ್ಣ ಸಣ್ಣ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪೀರಿಯನ್ಸಸ್ಸು ಎಷ್ಟರ ಮಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ನನಗೆ ಇಂಡಿವಿಜುವಲಿ ನನ್ನ ಪರ್ಸನಾಲಿಟಿ, ನನ್ನ ಪರ್ಸೆಪ್ಷನ್ ಟುವರ್ಡ್ಸ್ ಮೈ ಡೊಮೆಸ್ಟಿಕ್ ವರ್ಕರ್ಸ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಅದರ್ ಪೀಪಲ್, ನಾವು ಅಸಂಘಟಿತ ಅನ್ಆರ್ಗನೈಸ್ ಸೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಹಾಗೆ ಅಂತೆಲ್ಲ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತೀವಲ್ಲ, ಅವ್ರನ್ನ ನನಗೆ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಫೀಲ್ಡಲ್ಲಿ ನಂಗೆ ತುಂಬ ಹೆಲ್ಪ್ ಆಗ್ತಾಯಿತ್ತು. ಆಮೇಲೆ 2005ನಲ್ಲಿ ವ್ಯಾಸುಲು ಅವರಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಮಧುಸೂದನ್ ಅವರಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಅವ್ರಿಗೆಲ್ಲ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಗೊತ್ತಿದೆ. ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು IEC ಪ್ರೋಗ್ರಾಮ್ ಅಂತ ಈಗ ಹೇಳ್ತೀವಿ, ಅವೇರ್ನೆಸ್ ಕ್ರಿಯೇಷನ್ ಅಂತ ಆಗ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಿದ್ದು. ಬಜೆಟ್ದು ಮತ್ತು ಇದು ಪ್ರೊಹಿಬಿಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ದಿಸ್ ವೈಲೆನ್ಸ್ ಅಗೇನ್ಸ್ಟ್ ವಿಮೆನ್ ಆ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಬಂದಾಗ ಸೀರೀಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಪ್ರೋಗ್ರಾಮ್ಸ್ ಅದನ್ನು ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಅದನ್ನು ಬಜೆಟ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದರೆ ನನಗಂತೂ ದೇವರಾಣೆಗೂ ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ. ಅದನ್ನು ಎಷ್ಟು ಸಿಂಪ್ಲಿಫೈ ಆಗಿ ಮೋರ್ ದ್ಯಾನ್ 10 ಎಪಿಸೋಡ್ಸ್ ಆಲ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ರೇಡಿಯೋ ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ಬೇರೆಯವ್ರು ಇರಲಿ, ನಾನೇ ಟಾರ್ಗೆಟ್ ಆಗಿದ್ದೆ ವಾಟ್ ಈಸ್ ದಿಸ್ ಆ್ಯನ್ಯುವಲ್ ಬಜೆಟ್ ಅಂತ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದಕ್ಕೆ. ಅಷ್ಟು ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಅವರು ಅದನ್ನು ಶಮಂತ ಈ ಥರ ಬ್ಲೆಂಡ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಹೇಗಿರುತ್ತೆ, ಆ ಥರ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಹೇಗಿರುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತ ಕಂಪ್ಲೀಟ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ನಮ್ಮದು ಮೀಡಿಯಾದಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳ್ತೀವಿ. ಒಂದು ಸೀರಿಯಸ್ ಇಶ್ಯೂನ ತೊಗೊಂಡು ಹೌ ಟು ಕನ್ವರ್ಟ್ ಇಟ್ ಇಂಟು ಕಾಮನ್ ಮ್ಯಾನ್ಸ್ ಲ್ಯಾಂಗ್ವೇಜ್ ಅಂತ. ಆ ಥರ ನನಗೆ ಅದನ್ನು ಅವರು ಸಾರ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್, ನಾನು ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಏಕಲವ್ಯ ಶಿಷ್ಯನ ಅಂತ ಅನಿಸ್ಬಿಡುತ್ತೆ ಒಂದೊಂದು ಸಲ. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ನನಗೆ ನೀವೆಲ್ಲರೂ ನಾಟಕ ಅದು ಇದು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದಕ್ಕೆ ನನ್ನ ಪಾಡಿಗೆ ನಾನು ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ ಮೂಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಕೂತಿದ್ದೆ. ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ಶಶಿ ತರೂರ್ ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಅರ್ಥನೇ ಆಗಲ್ವಲ್ಲ, ಆ ಥರ ಇತ್ತು ನೀವುಗಳು ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದರೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಈ ಥಿಯೇಟರು, ಆರ್ಟ್, ಕಲ್ಚರ್ ಅಂತ ಬಂದಾಗ ಜಸ್ಟ್ ಐ ರಿಯಲಿ ವಾಂಟೆಡ್ ಟು ಶೇರ್. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಪರಿಚಯ ಆದಾಗ ವಿಷ್ಣು ತಂಗಿ ಅಂತ ಆದರು. ಬರ್ತಾ ಬರ್ತಾ ವಿಷ್ಣು ನನಗೆಲ್ಲೋ ಹೊರಟೋದ್ರು. ಆಮೇಲೆ ನಾನು ಪೂರ್ಣಿಮಾ ಒಳ್ಳೆ ಫ್ರೆಂಡ್ಸ್ ಆದ್ವಿ. ನನಗೊಂಚೂರು ಸ್ಲೈಟ್ ವರ್ಟಿಗೋ ಇದ್ದಾಗ, ನನಗೆ ಯೋಗ ಥೆರಪಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಕಂಟ್ರೋಲಿಗೆ ಬಂದಾಗ ಪೂರ್ಣಿಮಾಯಿಂದ ವಿಷ್ಣು ಅವರಿಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗಿ ವಿಷ್ಣು ನನ್ನ ಯೋಗ ಟೀಚರ್ಗೆ ಕೇಳಿ ಶಮಂತಾಗಿ ಹೀಗಾಯ್ತಂತಲ್ಲ, ನನಗೂ ಅದೇ ಆಸನ ಹೇಳ್ಕೊಡಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ, ಈ ಥರದ್ದೆಲ್ಲ ಪರ್ಸ್ನಲ್ ಇದಾಗಿದ್ದರಿಂದ ನನಗೆ ನಿಮಗೆಲ್ಲ ತುಂಬ ಅಕಾಡೆಮಿಕ್ ಆಗಿತ್ತು, ತುಂಬ ಸೆರೆಬ್ರಲ್ ಆಗಿತ್ತು ಅಂತ ಅನಿಸಿ ನಾನು ಟಿಪಿಕಲ್ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರು ಬಸವನಗುಡಿ ಥರ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ. ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು.
Thank you, ma'am. I would like to invite Amukta, Research Associate at CBPS, to give the vote of thanks.
We thank everyone here for being part of the memorial lecture and being such an enthusiastic audience. A special thanks to Mr. Amit Basole for his insights on why we need an employment policy, and more importantly, sir, I think for introducing us to some foundational principles that we must think about. I think we'll use them in our work hereafter. We thank Mr. Madhusudan for summarizing the lecture in Kannada. We would like to thank Mr. Jagdish for sharing his heartfelt memories of Poornima VYASULU with us. Also, sir and ma'am, don't know your names, but thanks a lot for sharing your memories as well. We are grateful for Professor Vinod VYASULU for his support and for helping us in preparing for today's event. I would like to thank the entire team of CBPS for successfully organizing this memorial lecture. CBPS has been organizing Poornima VYASULU Memorial Lecture since 2013, and her legacy continues to inspire us and direct us in our approach at work as well. We thank the Indian Institute of World Culture for providing us an opportunity to constantly organize public lectures. Thank you all for being part of this evening and making it beautiful. Thank you.